Loving the High Warlock. Written by Amelia Shaw. A prequel to the Daughters of the Warlock series. Set 24 years before Book 1 Sisters of the Coven. Chapter 1. The last thing I expected to see when I walked down 17th Street was Matlock Adenolfi. I nearly tripped and fell when I was instantaneously paralyzed. I always knew how powerful Matlock was, but this reaction was new. My traitorous body freezing at the sight of his tall, muscular physique. His short dark hair and ruggedly handsome face reminded me just how much I both adored and loathed the man. I forced myself to move quickly before he saw me. I stepped around a thick oak tree planted neatly in a break on the sidewalk to give the streets more of a suburban feel. The trees adapted well, though they weren't fans of being uprooted and deposited in the middle of an urban area just to get some green splashing against the steel gray. The magic realm was advancing both in population growth and technology, which meant buildings were starting to get taller, architecture was getting sleeker, and individuality was falling by the wayside. The trees were a way to remind us of our roots, so to speak. But regardless of why the tree was planted there, I was glad to have a place to hide. Hopefully, he hadn't seen me. I might have made a spectacle of myself keeling over, then bolting behind the tree. But besides an elderly couple who sneered at me, I don't think anyone else noticed. Genevieve? Of course. I rolled my eyes, glancing up at the sky. Why was I not surprised? It would seem the goddess was not smiling on me today. Probably because I'd missed the last few Sundays of morning ritual. Oh well. Religion was on its way out anyway. I cleared my throat and stepped out from behind the tree, glancing at the ground as though I'd lost something. Other than my mind, of course. You looking for something? I didn't notice until now, but Matlock was with someone, an older man in his early 40s with short brown hair combed to the side. He was one of the council members. My heart started to thud against my chest, and my palms started to perspire. I didn't like being nervous, and the council always sparked that reaction in me. Their presence made me feel as though I had done something wrong, even though I hadn't. At least, I didn't think I had. You never knew with the council. They changed the rules at the drop of a hat. Just my earring, I said. I forced my eyes to focus on the cement, even though I knew I wasn't going to find anything. Hopefully, neither of them would notice my hands shaking. Although if they did, I'd blame it on the cold. I was only in a light summer dress with no sleeves, made of thin, worn material. It was still September, but fall was fast approaching. A chill lingered in the air even after the sun burned the morning away. You mean the one right here? Without warning, Matlock stepped closer to me, brushed my long blonde hair back and tugged gently on my earlobe. If my skin could sizzle, it would have. Not an experience I wished to entertain. I didn't want to react to Matlock, to his touch. It brought back memories that I desperately wanted to forget. Memories of us together, sneaking off and making love or holding hands. Talking for hours on end. Stolen glances. Swollen lips. In that single touch, the emotions that came with it were too much for me. I flinched, trying to ignore the way my skin clawed at me to get closer to him. I suddenly wasn't capable of breathing, which, at 21 years old, was much more dramatic than I liked to think myself capable of. But Matlock made me feel things I had never felt before. He always had. Oh right, I forced myself to say. Thanks. Matlock narrowed his eyes. He could tell I was faking it, which annoyed me. We hadn't seen each other in months, yet somehow, he was still able to distinguish my true emotions. Damn it, I needed to do a better job of masking them. They would eventually be my downfall, especially if said emotions were inspired by Matlock himself. I guess I was just confused, I replied. I curled hair behind my ear, trying to conceal the way my fingers shook. I didn't want him to notice that he still had a profound effect on me. I already knew how pathetic it was, and I didn't need him to realize it as well. Matlock's deep brown eyes lingered on me much longer than I would have liked. It was as though he could see through me. I often wondered if that was one of his magical abilities. Granted, I had never heard of someone having that ability before, but anything was possible. Some magic was kept a secret. Matlock. The voice behind him broke through our awkward tension. I was grateful for it, even though I didn't like the guy who was doing the interrupting. Graham Hollow. He was twice Matlock's age and a junior council member. Ah, Graham. Matlock laid on the charm thickly, flashing a smile. How easy it was for him to switch over to High Warlock mode. I almost wanted to scream at him, to demand to know if any of our love had been real, but I kept my burning thoughts to myself. He gestured to me. This is an old school friend, Genevieve. Genevieve, this is my colleague Graham Hollow. I knew exactly who he was, and the last thing I wanted was to be introduced to the man. But I couldn't let either of them know that, so I forced myself to stick out my hand and put a cheery smile on my face that I definitely didn't feel. Nice to meet you, Mr. Hollow, I said. Graham glanced at my hand before looking at me. The sneer on his face didn't falter, as though he were some kind of marble statue carved out with disgust as its signature look. He shifted his eyes over to Matlock, his expression unchanged. He seemed to be telling Matlock that he would rather swallow fire than touch me. Which was fine by me because it wasn't like I wanted to touch him. The sun was already beginning to set, the blue sky sprinkled with darkness. In less than an hour, the sky would be ink, black, speckled with sparkling stars and a waning moon slowly fading to darkness itself. I wanted to go home. My father would probably be working late. We weren't exactly the wealthiest family here, so anytime he could take extra shifts, he did. Even if it meant working consecutive 16-hour days. Sometimes we didn't see each other for a week. My mother had died in a magical accident at her work when I was young. So it had always just been my dad and me. Matlock, Graham said in a low voice. We really must be moving along. They're expecting us. Matlock looked back at me. I arched a brow at him, surprised. It almost seemed like he cared about my thoughts on the situation, as though he didn't want to leave. But that couldn't be. Matlock had made it clear when he broke things off between us that his priority was the council. His future. It had to be. I couldn't even be upset with him because he was going to be the most powerful and renowned warlock in all the realms. The High Warlock. You go on, Graham, Matlock said, though his dark eyes stayed fixed on me. I'll be there in a bit. Matlock, need I remind you that they are expecting you? Graham demanded. The council is waiting on our arrival, and if we're late. I said. Matlock finally ripped his eyes away from mine so he could glare at Graham. You go on ahead. I will be there, Graham. There was something in his tone I'd never heard before. Something harsh. A warning. A shiver crawled down my spine just listening to it. I'd never expected Matlock's voice could be so cold. Instead of listening, Graham stayed where he was. We cannot be late, Matlock, he said, his voice hard and unflinching. You know the consequences. Especially if they find out the reason for your tardiness is. They won't learn the reason for my tardiness because you won't tell them. Matlock was making a play I didn't understand and one I wasn't sure what to counter with. Do you understand, Graham? Graham clenched his teeth together so hard they popped. You know, he said, each word clipped, just because you will be High Warlock someday doesn't mean you are now. Might I remind you that your affections have been spoken for already? If you're referring to my engagement, say as much, Matlock instructed. Now his rich baritone voice was bored rather than authoritative, like Graham wasn't someone to be bothered with. My affections have nothing to do with the person I'm forced to marry. I caution you regarding to whom you speak about such things, Graham said. His eyes slid over to me for a long moment before returning to Matlock. I don't think I need to remind you that words have consequences. We are magic, after all. Slip up and say the wrong thing, and a spell could be altered and cause grave consequences. The same can be applied here. I'll endure the consequences if any come my way, he replied with a lift of his chin and a hard glint in his eye. I will not tell you again, Graham. Is that an order? Matlock's eyes narrowed. If it needs to be. Graham lingered a moment longer. Honestly, I was surprised that he didn't say anything more. Graham appeared to be resentful of taking direction from Matlock. I couldn't blame him. The man was older, more experienced. But Graham was not the High Warlock. He would never have that position, which meant Matlock could get away with giving orders. Don't linger, Graham warned. Before Matlock could reply, Graham spun on his heel and resumed walking away. I almost snickered. He looked like he was walking with a stick up his ass, so offended was he at what Matlock had said. I can't believe you just told him that, I said, smoothing the wrinkles of my dress down. Why not? Matlock asked. I don't appreciate him telling me what to do. I bit my bottom lip, refraining from saying what I really thought. How they were already telling him what to do by dictating who he would marry, and what he had to do every minute of every day for the rest of his life. Well then, I said, what do you want to do? When I finally looked at him, he gave me a smile. I want to walk you home. Chapter 2. You really didn't need to walk me home, Matlock. Though walk was a strange word to use. My father and I lived several miles out of the city, so we used our magic to transport ourselves from a specific shop to the end of our street. It meant we did a little walking, but mostly it was magic that carried me home. I wasn't trying to be rude. If anything, I was trying to be nice. I was thinking of Matlock, of his reputation. What would people think if they saw him walking someone like me home? We were from two different worlds. There was a reason we weren't together. Besides the fact he was a pain in my ass, he came from a background of privilege. One of these days, he was going to be the most important warlock in the entire realm. I, on the other hand, was a witch from a rural part of town. I was lucky I got my scholarship and that my father insisted I further my learning. He always told me that education was one of the most important things, and if I ever had children of my own, which was not likely, I should take care and ensure that he or she was educated as well. I didn't let myself worry about children. I highly doubted such a thing would happen. I didn't want kids, especially not in this world. I wanted to make sure you got home safely, he said. Are you saying you don't think I'm capable of getting home on my own? I asked, narrowing my eyes. He leaned his tall, lithe frame against the awning on the front porch. My father must still be at work because the windows were black, filled with shadows rather than light. Of course not, he said through a sigh. Why is everything a fight with you? Why do you have such a big chip on your shoulder? He slid his hands into his pockets. Jen, you're the best, smartest, most talented witch I know. No one is going to mess with you. I just wanted to spend more time with you, so you could protect me. I laughed despite myself. I had no idea how Matlock did it, but he had this ability to crawl under my skin and stay there even when I wanted to rip him out. He still found some way to make me laugh, even if I didn't want to. It was hard to picture him as a High Warlock, even harder to picture him married to someone else who wasn't me. I cleared my throat. Now was not the time to think about that. Especially not with us being alone. Again. You're quiet, Matlock said, tilting his head and narrowing his eyes. He studied me in a way that made me feel nervous and comfortable at the same time. I've learned that you being quiet is not a good thing. What are you plotting? Should I be girding my loins? I laughed again and twirled my finger through my hair. I took in the rolling hills, the trees, the way the sun hid behind the horizon, leaving a trail of gold. There was something so peaceful about living away from the city. As much as I loved my education, I loved living in solitude even more. Not that I would tell my father that. In fact, I wouldn't tell him a lot of things, including the fact that Matlock had been here. which made me make a mental note to diminish any trace magic Matlock might leave behind once he disappeared. My dad wasn't a fan of Matlock, since he'd discovered that he was engaged to another witch. Even though I'd tried to explain it wasn't a love match, that Matlock didn't care for her, my father refused to listen. "Why are you the one risking everything for him?" he questioned one night over dinner. "Do you really think he's going to leave his fiancée for you? You don't just cancel a contract like an arranged marriage. You aren't free to do what you want. Not when you're a puppet controlled by the council." I loved my father. I got my dramatic flair from him. But in this case, he was wrong. Matlock was not going to be a puppet. How could he be? He was going to be the most powerful warlock ever. Once he settled into his role, he would break his engagement and marry me. I had been sure of it. Until he hadn't. Until he broke my heart 3 months ago. In his defense, he'd looked pretty upset about it too. I wouldn't say he'd cried, but his eyes got glassy and his words were rigid. I'd never seen him so distraught, although that wasn't saying much because Matlock wasn't the sort to get perturbed by anything. That night, though, he had been. And when he broke up with me, I knew the happy man I'd fallen in love with was gone. I wasn't sure what replaced him. At that point, I hadn't cared. But Matlock was a different man now. That was what I needed to remind myself. He'd changed. I couldn't let myself get swept up in him. Not again. I just put all the pieces of my broken heart back together. "Genevieve." His voice saying my name was like a spell. My attention snapped back to reality and focused on him and him alone. I blinked, realizing he was waiting for me to respond. "I'm quiet because I'm thinking," I admitted, looking down at my hands in my lap. I tugged at my fingernails. I was ruthless when it came to biting them, and my father had given me a potion that would stop me from the awful habit. It should have worked, but I still had the desire to pick at them when stressed. "Why are you here, Matlock? Why walk me home? What is this?" He opened his mouth, his eyes searching the ground. "Would you mind if we went inside for a moment?" I glanced around. He was right. It was better if we spoke someone more private. I opened the front door and gestured for him to follow me inside, leading him into the small living room and falling down onto one of the comfortable chairs. I gestured for him to sit. "Now go on. Tell me." "Honestly, I just wanted an excuse to spend time with you," he admitted, thrumming his fingers on his knees. "You know, I thought I'd forgotten about you, about us, and how you made me feel. Then I saw you, and it was like you'd never left." My heart thundered against my chest, the sound echoing in my head. This was exactly what I didn't want to hear. It was only going to make things more difficult than they needed to be. Matlock and I couldn't be together. He'd made that clear. And for the past 3 months, I had survived without him the best I could. "I don't think you know what you're saying." I reached up and curled my hair behind my ear. "I know exactly what I'm saying," he said, a smile quivering on his lips. The room was small, and he was already smothering me with his presence. I didn't want to smell him. I didn't want to be close enough to touch him. I didn't want any of that. He continued, "I want you to hear it. I want you to know what you mean to me, Genevieve. Before, I took it all for granted. We were on and off all throughout school. I thought after the last time, we would find each other again." I glared at him. "How could you think I wanted to be with you after you told me you had a fiancé?" I pressed my lips together. Even though I lived outside the city and my neighbors were distant, I didn't want anyone listening in on our conversation. And in the magic realm, you never knew who was listening. I waved my hand in the air, checking for the magical protection barriers my father had in place. Yes, they were still there. "I wanted to be honest with you," he said. "I thought I was doing the right thing by telling you, by breaking up with you. But part of me hoped." "Hoped what?" I interrupted, throwing my arms out. "Hoped that I'd come crawling back?" Hoped I had no dignity, no self-respect? Hoped that you might still love me the way I still love you, he whispered. My heart sank. Part of me wanted to indulge in another outburst. Even now, I could feel my magic inside of me swirling, pushing against my skin, begging to be released. I could do something creative with my powers, like give Matlock a second head. Maybe that would ease the way my heart felt heavy inside of me, stop my stomach dropping to my feet. Tears pricked my eyes and I cursed myself. This was the worst thing that could have happened. I didn't want to hear those words from Matlock because they were exactly the ones I'd been hoping to hear, no, dreaming of hearing for the past 3 months. It was selfish of me. He was going to marry someone else, someone of whom the council approved. I was not ever going to be that person, and they knew it. Not that they would ever consider me. I took a deep breath and focused on the man in front of me. He had to know how wrong this was. Why would I torture myself with loving you when we can't be together? I asked him. My voice cracked despite my struggle to stay strong. I released a breath, a shudder ripping through my body as I did so. Everything inside of me told me to kiss him, to hold him, to pretend that it wasn't wrong. But it was. Why would I let myself be led on by you? It would hurt too much, Matlock. Just seeing you today ripped me to shreds. Don't you understand that? I stood up from the couch and balled my fists. I shouldn't have let you walk me home. I shouldn't have invited you inside. That was stupid. No. He shook his head, then he stood, but he didn't immediately come to me. That was a good thing, because I probably would have ripped his head off if he'd tried. I couldn't let him touch me, especially knowing that I would give in if he did. It wasn't stupid, Genevieve. I want you. Can't you see that? I've been miserable without you. I want to be around you, breathe the same air as you. I need you in my life. I snorted and turned away. My back was to him, my face towards the window. I couldn't see the moon behind the charcoal gray clouds where I was. I'm not lying to you, he said. Then he reached out and took my hand. He stepped in front of me so he blocked my view of the window, demanding my full attention. What do you need me to do to prove that to you? If I told you to leave, would you listen? I asked, my voice soft. You don't want me to leave, he replied, bringing my hand up to his mouth. He placed a kiss on my palm, and I hated that another shudder racked my body. I don't? I asked. No. He dropped his lips to my wrist. In fact, you were wondering if I could stay a little bit longer. I am. A kiss on the inside of my forearm. I didn't understand why it sent such shockwaves through my system. These were kisses. Just kisses. They weren't infused with incantations or potions. They weren't spellbound or paralytic. And yet, they rendered me completely useless. If I weren't so lost in the moment, I would be ashamed of myself for how easy it was for Matlock to make me so entirely incapable of resisting him. What was wrong with me? Oh yes. He kissed my shoulder. Because you've missed me. Very much. You're secretly delighted I walked you home. And you want me to kiss you now. I snapped open my eyes so they locked with his. We were treading on dangerous ground here, but I couldn't help it. I should deny him. I should tell him to go to hell. But the words wouldn't come to my lips. Matlock moved closer to me, gently dropping my arm so he could cup my cheek. My Genevieve, he murmured, his lips ghosting across my own. And then he kissed me. Chapter 3. I would probably regret both letting him kiss me and kissing him back. But in this moment, I didn't care. I was too caught up in his touch, in the feeling of finally being back in his arms again. I didn't even care if this was just some cruel game and at the end of this night, he would wake up and leave me. We had now. His lips never left mine as he maneuvered me down the small hallway and to the last door on the left. He hadn't been to my house in months, but he still knew the way to my room. Granted, It was not difficult considering the small house we lived in, but still. When we reached the door, he pressed me up against it. His lips left mine for the briefest of seconds before he claimed my throat with a kiss. I gasped, tilting my head to the side to give him better access. He knew how sensitive my neck was, and that hadn't changed. "Don't stop," I murmured. I don't know why I said it. My head was clouded with the mist of his kisses, and I wasn't behaving with any sort of logic. But I didn't care when he kissed me, and I sure as hell didn't care now that his body was pressed against mine and I could feel his desire for me push against my hip. "Wasn't going to," he replied. "Cocky bastard." I wrapped my arms around his neck and arched my back, so his cock pressed against the apex between my thighs. He let out a stifled moan. Even through our clothes, he was still affected by me. "You don't play fair, Jen," he said. "That's why you love me," I said through a snort. Suddenly, he peeled his eyes open and stared at me. For a moment, I was confused. I had no idea why he'd gone all weird on me, until I realized what I'd just said. "You love me." I cleared my throat, my cheeks pinching. I could feel the heat of my mortification turning my normally fair cheeks red. The last thing I wanted to do was ruin the mood. We hadn't seen each other in ages, and I missed him. The words had come out of my mouth so naturally, it was hard to deny what I was feeling anymore. I just wanted him. "It's true," he acknowledged. He ran his finger across my full bottom lip, staring so intently at my mouth I thought my face would combust into flames. It was difficult to breathe. I didn't want to do anything to distract him, to stop him from talking. I wanted to pretend like I didn't want to hear it, but I did. I wanted to know what he felt, if anything. I wanted to know it all, even if it killed me to hear it. "I do love you," he repeated. "For so many reasons. That has not changed." "Please stop," I whispered. I wanted him to kiss me, touch me, make love to me so that I could forget everything else. "I thought you said not to," he said, his brow furrowing with worry. "Just don't talk." I swallowed, looking away. "I want to pretend." "What? What do you want to pretend?" I wanted to pretend that he wasn't the High Warlock, that I wasn't the daughter of a blue-collar warlock who wasn't deemed worthy for the attention of someone like Matlock. I wanted to pretend that he wasn't engaged to someone he didn't love, and that he wouldn't one day marry her and have children with her, while I didn't even know what I was going to do with my life. I hadn't thought about my future. In fact, I barely knew what I was going to do tomorrow, let alone in a year from now. I hoped I could further my education. I wanted to take care of my parents financially, as they'd done for me. But love? A family? I wasn't even sure I could take care of myself. But a child? A husband? The words made me bristle. "Tell me what you want of me and I'll do it, Jen," Matlock said, his voice a ghost of a whisper as it caressed my skin. I closed my eyes and he kissed my neck once, twice. Shivers slid through me. His arms wrapped around me, slipped underneath my dress, reached up and unclasped my bra. I didn't stop him. I probably should have, but I didn't. "Genevieve," he murmured, kissing the column of my throat again. Slowly my eyes slid shut. "Tell me." "I need you, Matlock," I said. I forced myself to open my eyes, to try and look at him, but they were hooded, hazy with desire. I know it's wrong, but I can't help what I want." I released a breath. You should go." Damn, it hurt to say it. "But what if that's not what I want?" he asked. "Matlock." I forced myself to look at him, to try to make him understand. "You know this, we're going nowhere fast. It will only end in disaster." "Who says it has to end?" Matlock asked. He tried to kiss me again, but I pulled away from him. He gave me space, which I appreciated, but was suddenly hit with how cold I was without his touch. I wrapped my arms around myself, annoyed that I'd stopped the best thing to happen to me in months. "Jen, why are you worried about this?" Matlock asked again. You know I love you. What do I need to do to prove it to you? Break up with your fiancé, I blurted before I could stop myself. Shit. Talk about laying all your cards out at once. He flinched. You know I have no control over that, Jen, he said. If I could, I would. You know that. How? How do I know that? I demanded. How do I know that everything out of your mouth isn't a lie? Matlock, you're a puppet. The council is telling you who to marry. How crazy is that? That's how it's always been done, he returned. No, it hasn't, I said. What? I shook my head. I'd done my research when I thought there was a chance for us as a couple. But I knew now that would never happen. And until I could verify anything, I would keep my thoughts to myself. I didn't even want to tell Matlock what I'd found in my research, because I didn't want to put him at risk. I didn't want him to look into something the council preferred to keep deeply hidden. Genevieve, he said again, pulling me close. My feelings for you haven't changed, I promise. I love you now and always have. I always will. Being separated from you has been torture. Do you think I wanted to break up? Do you think I want to marry someone who isn't you? My heart stalled. You want to marry me? I asked softly. Of course I want to marry you, he said, running his fingers through his nearly black hair. I knew he only did that when he was frustrated. How could you not know that? Matlock, you're engaged to someone else. It's not what I want, he said, his words insistent, almost desperate. He sucked in a breath, like he realized he needed to settle himself down, and ran a hand over the stubble on his cheek. You are what I want. You, General, and I know that our relationship isn't in an ideal place. And you can be angry with me about that. But please don't ever question my love for you. I hesitated. I didn't question his feelings, only his actions. I knew he loved me. But what would he do for that love? What would he do for me? I didn't want to be that girl who needed her man to prove what he said. I trusted him. But I also wasn't that girl who liked to hide away in the shadows, who would allow other people to dictate what I did and the decisions I made. Love? I asked. We'd said the word before, of course. It was exactly what I felt for him. But suddenly it was too much. Overwhelming. It was intoxicating to hear, and not in a good way. It was an excuse, a justification for what we were about to do together. Of course, love, he said, staring into my eyes. What you and I have is love, Genevieve. It's not silly or inconsequential. It's deep and meaningful and profound. What I feel for you, I don't feel for anyone else. I never will. Hearing that, my heart soared. I don't know why. They were words, and Matlock was so good with his words it hurt. Because he could convince me the sky was green even as I stared at it, seeing blue. That frightened me because he could lie to me, and even knowing it was a lie, my foolish heart would believe him. I was smarter than that. But when he was here, I forgot about being smart. I didn't want to be smart now. Foolish and reckless and careless were all very appealing at the moment. I didn't even care if he smashed my heart into a million pieces. That misery was for another day. At this moment, I wanted to take what I wanted and refuse to feel guilty for it. No one was going to dictate my behavior. Matlock was in front of me. He was kissing me, holding me, wanting me the same way I wanted him. Who was I to deny myself what I wanted? How was that fair to me? Passion burned my blood. Any lingering doubts were immediately banished. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't care. Maybe I would in the morning, but now? Now it was time to be selfish. I pulled him in for a kiss. He didn't hesitate to wrap me back in his arms. I warred with him, our tongues dueling for dominance. We tugged at each other's clothes until we were both stripped naked. He was barely visible in the shadows of my room, and somehow, I never felt more seen in my life. Moving as one, we made our way to the bed, and I laid down, Matlock crawling on top of me as if he were stalking me. His hands traced patterns on my hot skin. His lips sucked a nipple into his mouth while his hand fondled my other breast. I let out a moan, squeezing my eyes shut as a wave of pleasure crashed over me. A sob caught in my throat. I'd missed him so much. "I've missed your noises," he murmured against my skin. "God, I've missed you, General." My core pulsated with need. One hand reached up and I threaded my fingers through his thick hair, holding him in position. I didn't want this to end. His hardness pressed into my hip. I could feel the moisture on my skin. He wanted me just like I wanted him. Matlock released my breast and shifted as he gave attention to the other one. I let out a small whimper as pleasure arrowed deep into my belly. When he finished loving on my breasts, he trailed his lips downward until he reached the apex of my thighs. I gasped as he licked my most sensitive spot, my toes curling and my eyes rolling to the back of my head. This was new. Something he'd never done before. It was only a matter of moments, a few kisses to my sensitive flesh, and I was ready to burst. It was magic, some kind of spell. At the last moment, just as I was grabbing onto the sheets beneath me and arching my back to reach that final pinnacle, he pulled away, leaving me aching and needy. I let out a frustrated whimper. "Patience," he murmured as he slid back up my trembling body and lay down between my wet thighs once more. "I want to feel you come around me when I'm inside you." I nodded fervently. I wanted that too. I grabbed onto his shoulders as he positioned himself and eased into me. Gasping, I felt the blunt hardness of his cock opening me. "You feel so good," he whispered. "My Genevieve." He began to rock back and forth while I held on tightly to him, not wanting to lose a bit of contact. The pleasure resumed quickly as I rode the wave of ecstasy building inside of me. It was only moments before his name danced on my lips, and my body tightened and began to spasm around him. Matlock thrust harder and faster, then finally groaned and his seed pulsed in hot waves within me. When he finished, he rolled off but took me with him, keeping me in his arms. "Never again," I managed to get out. "We can't do this again." "Yeah," he breathed out. "You're right." He'd said it before, and from the smile on his face, he assumed he'd say it again another day. And he was probably right. With a fire that burned between us like this, how were we ever to stay apart? Chapter 4. I wasn't lying when I said what happened between us couldn't happen again. Or perhaps I should have said, shouldn't. Because it wasn't long until I found myself tangled up in his arms, again and again. No one knew what was going on between us. He would slip away from his council duties when he had the time, and I would leave class early in order to meet him. I didn't think my parents knew, but occasionally over dinner, my father would give me a look that hinted that he might. Whenever that happened, I always ignored it and asked about his work. So far, he'd gone with the flow of the conversation, never calling me out, never demanding answers. I was grateful that he didn't push, although I was tempted to tell him everything. But then I would stop myself. I couldn't get him involved. Technically, what Matlock and I were doing was treasonous. We could be prosecuted for it, and by we, I meant me. They weren't going to punish Matlock. I was the one risking everything. At least with my secrecy, my dad had plausible deniability. "This is the last time," I said between kisses as Matlock all but ripped off my shirt. He made sure every time we were intimate, there was a protective spell that would alert us to surprise guests, and soundproof the walls to safeguard that we couldn't be overheard. "If you say so," he replied, even though we both knew that wasn't the case. Afterwards, I stared up at my ceiling, blankets covering my chest, his arm wrapped around my waist as he nuzzled my shoulder. Something dropped in my stomach like an anchor was tied to my guts. I didn't know what it was, but I was left feeling agitated. Like something was wrong and everything was about to change. Part of me wanted to believe that Matlock would be able to convince the council that I was worthy, that he should marry me instead of her face. I wanted to believe that more than anything. Yet in this moment, I couldn't help but be left feeling unsettled. Like something was coming and I wasn't going to like it. I can hear you thinking, he murmured, his lips vibrating against my skin. I smiled despite myself. The last thing I wanted to do was tell him about my feelings. He had other things to worry about, and at the moment, my feelings were simply that. A gut instinct. What am I thinking, then? I asked, hoping he wouldn't notice how tense and robotic my fingers were as I trailed them through his hair. That you want me to do it again, he replied. Unfortunately, I don't think I can stand up right now. He brought my fingers to his mouth and kissed each one. I wish I could put you in my bag and take you with me. When are you leaving again? I asked, turning on my side so I could look into his eyes. I had known about this trip the night Matlock found out about it, a few days ago. As High Warlock, Matlock was expected to visit different realms, introduce himself to the leaders, and conduct meetings. Of course, everything that came out of Matlock was just regurgitated from the council, but I didn't bring that up. He was touchy on the subject, not because he was in denial, but because he knew the truth and wasn't thrilled. Not that he was going to do anything about it. Why? He asked, kissing my shoulder. Will you miss me terribly? I rolled my eyes. As much as I wanted to laugh, I couldn't. A smile was as much as I could give, and even that was fleeting. We had been sneaking around the past few weeks, and although it was exhilarating and fun, it couldn't last. It wouldn't. Especially not with him being given more and more responsibility with his duties. I'm being serious, I said, playfully smacking him on the shoulder. As am I, he pointed out. No need to be so violent, darling. Really? I gave him a look. His eyes softened. He must have realized I wasn't in the mood to play, because he shifted in the bed until he sat up, his back resting against my headboard. Come here, he said, pulling me into his lap and holding onto my waist again. I didn't want to, but I couldn't resist him. That seemed to be the story of my life with Matlock. I had good intentions. I knew what was right and what was wrong, and being with Matlock was wrong. But somehow I didn't care. I rested my head on his chest, shifting so I could hear the steady beat of his heart. With his arms around me, I felt safe. I closed my eyes. It would be so easy to just fall asleep here, just like this. You know there's nothing I can do about the trip, he said. Apparently, we're traveling to a shifter realm to get to know the people there. It should be a good way to introduce myself to them. Shifters? I asked, glancing up at his face. Are you scared? Why would I be scared? He asked, his lips curling up into a smile. Because you're the High Warlock? I asked, frowning at him. No way. You're my girl, he said, kissing the top of my head. Because if anything happened to me, you would kick their asses. I rolled my eyes but then shut them again. The thoughts that had been nagging me were being held at bay, but they wouldn't disappear. Do you think things could ever be different? I asked before I could stop myself. Different? What do you mean? I just mean, do you think there's a chance that you and I would get to a point where we wouldn't have to hide all the time? I asked. I traced patterns with my index finger on his chest. He was tense beneath me, and as much as I wanted to believe it was because of my touch, it wasn't. He was uncomfortable, and I'd made him feel that way by asking a question he didn't want to contemplate. Regardless of the tendrils of guilt clawing at my insides for ruining what was otherwise a romantic moment between the two of us, I pushed forward. Maybe because I was stubborn and needed answers. Maybe because I needed something more than just talk of feelings. Feelings weren't going to keep us together at the end of the day. Even Matlock had to know that. I swallowed hard and forced myself to ask the one question that would make or break us. Do you think there's a chance that you and I could be together publicly? Genevieve, he said, and I flinched. I hated when he said my name like that, like I was a disappointment. He began to stroke my hair and I relaxed, but only slightly. "What do you want me to say?" he murmured. I don't know," I said quickly. I splayed my fingers across my shoulders, stopping my tracing of his skin for the time being. "I just feel like we're in this cycle, and it's unhealthy. I don't like it." "You don't like being with me?" Matlock asked, his voice hurt and surprised. "Stop." I frowned, suddenly annoyed. "Don't do that. Don't twist my words around." "I'm just trying to understand the meaning behind your words, Genevieve," he said, trying to stifle a yawn but failing. "You know I have to leave early. I'd like to enjoy the few hours I still have with you here, my arms wrapped around you. Let's go to sleep. I'd rather not fight." "This isn't a fight," I insisted. "It's not. It's just—" "What then? What is it? What do we have to talk about right now?" A prickle of anger sparked deep inside of me. I wasn't trying to provoke an argument. That wasn't my intention at all. But if that was how he was going to react when all I wanted was to discuss something that was bothering me, that was on him. I wasn't being aggressive, but he was handling me like I was. That wasn't fair. "Matlock," I said, trying to keep my patience. "I'm not trying to provoke an argument. I promise. It's hard for me." He softened. "What's hard for you?" He let out a sigh through his nose. "I know the situation you're in is difficult, Genevieve. I do. But I can't help you if I don't know what it is you want. I can't give you what I want to give you. I can only do what I can. It's not fair to you. I know that." "Then why are we still together?" I found myself asking. I held the pillow close to my body, needing some sort of comfort. As much as I loved Matlock, I didn't think I'd get it from him. Not right now. "Why are we torturing ourselves? Don't you want me completely, Matlock? Doesn't it hurt knowing we can't have everything?" "Of course it does," he exclaimed. He threw his long legs over the bed and stood up, waving his hand in the air. Why he was suddenly so angry, I didn't know. I wasn't afraid of his temper, but I was confused by it. I wanted to understand it. Of course, I want what's best for us. I want to hold your hand in public. I want to fucking marry you. My eyes widened. Pulling up the blanket, I held it close to my chest. You want to marry me? Seriously? Why wouldn't I?" He turned to look at me as he began to get dressed. His tone softened, but there was still an edge to it. "Jen, I love you more than anything in this world. You know I do. But I can't give you what you deserve, and I hate it. And I pretend when I'm with you that this is our life. That we don't have to hide away from everyone. That there aren't consequences to the choices I make, but that's not the world we live in." "What does that mean?" I asked. I let the blanket fall to my waist, my hands animated with excitement. "Matlock, I've been doing research. With our powers, we could create our own realm. We could go there and never come back. We could live how we wanted. We could be together. Our own realm." He furrowed his brow, buttoning his shirt. "Genevieve, please. You'd really leave your father?" I hesitated. I don't know. If it meant being with you." I let my voice trail off. "I think we're getting ahead of ourselves," he said. He knelt down when he finished dressing and took my face in his hands. "I should go. But I promise we'll talk about this when I get back, okay? I love you." He gave me a kiss on the lips and one long, lingering look before walking out my door. I settled back in my bed against the pillows and stared up at the ceiling. I didn't know why, but I couldn't help but think something had irrevocably shifted in our relationship. If you could even call it that. And whatever that change was, it wasn't good. Chapter 5. When I woke up the next morning, I was rushing to the bathroom, my stomach heaving. I managed to keep the privacy spell intact so I wouldn't wake my father with the loud noises I made while throwing up. I must have caught a stomach bug. That, or the food Matlock grabbed for us last night hadn't sat well with me. After flushing the toilet, I hopped into the shower to wash away the smell of sex and sick. Not a good combination. Then I got ready for work. A few weeks ago, I'd managed to get a job as the dean's assistant at the Warlock Academy. The necessary skills were far below my abilities, but it was the only thing I could find on short notice, and it meant I was eligible a discount on my tuition fees. It was boring, easy, and completely unchallenging. But my best friend also worked in the dean's office, so essentially I was getting paid to hang out with Allison. I skipped breakfast and headed out, deciding some tea would help my stomach more than food. It seemed to be settled for now, and I didn't have any other symptoms, so I was beginning to think something I ate was the cause of my distress. I headed into the academy, nodding my head to everyone I knew, which was practically everybody. The college was relatively small. Most warlocks and witches started their career right after finishing high school and rarely attended college unless they could afford it. I was one of the few exceptions to that rule, something I was proud of. Well, look what the cat dragged in. I grinned, hearing my best friend's voice as I stepped into the small office. Allison was already positioned behind the counter, headset attached to her head, ready to answer any calls the office received. Her eyes scanned me up and down and her face soured. No. No, what? I asked sheepishly. Allison rolled her eyes. She had such gorgeous colored irises, it was hard not to stare at them, even if they were contorted into a glare in my direction. She glanced around before casting a spell under her breath and flinging her fingers in front of her. A privacy spell. Once she was satisfied it was in place, she turned to me, shooting out of her chair like a frog. "I thought you were done with him," she said, pointing an accusing finger at me. "You promised, General, you promised you weren't going to see him anymore." "Who?" I asked, walking around the desk so I could grab the knob on my office door. I needed to escape her keen gaze. She knew me too well. Allison narrowed her eyes. "Don't play dumb, Jen," she said. "It's not a good look on you." I sighed. "What do you want me to say?" I asked. "How long?" She raised her eyebrows and crossed her arms over her chest. I looked at the floor. I didn't know why, but Allison had this uncanny way of making me feel like I was a child. A naughty child at that. Was I making a stupid decision to have an illicit affair with the next High Warlock? Yes. But did she need to make me feel stupid about it? No. My conversation from the night before with Matlock flitted into my head, and immediately, I banished it. Those thoughts weren't helping my case. If anything, they were only adding to the guilt Allison was heaping on me. I swallowed hard, turning so my back leaned against the door to my office. There was no point in arguing with her. She would find out, eventually. Not because word would get back to her, but she would get it out of me. 3 weeks, give or take. This time. Maybe longer. I don't know. How? She asked. She wasn't even capable of formulating full sentences. Instead, she demanded answers from me. Answers I didn't want to give her. "We ran into each other on the street a while back," I said. When I noticed her expression, I glared. "I swear. I didn't go looking for him. What more do you want?" "I don't want you to do this, Jen, that's what I want," she said, as though it were the most obvious thing in the world. "You're my best friend, so I know how much potential you have. And you're just throwing your life away for someone who wouldn't do the same for you." I clenched my teeth together to stop myself from snapping back at her. The last thing I wanted to do was admit that she was right, but I couldn't deny her claims either. Those worries kept me up at night, long after Matlock fell asleep or left. After the moon made its way down and the sun rose in the sky. Where was this going? Where would it lead? I wanted to believe that Matlock would do anything for me, but I didn't know that for sure. And unfortunately, I had more proof of what he wouldn't do rather than what he would. Why can't you just let me have this? I asked, grinding my teeth together. The ticking clock above me grated on my nerves and echoed through my head. Because you're better than this, Allison said. Then the phone rang. Her finger hovered over the answer button, as though she was debating whether or not to answer the call. After another moment, she sighed and pressed it. Dean Patrick's office, how may I direct your call? Relief loosened my shoulders, and I forced myself to enter my office before Allison followed me. I needed space from all the tension. All the unanswered questions. Allison wasn't wrong, but that didn't mean I needed her to tell me I was wrong. And after feeling so sick this morning, I didn't want to deal with anything else. I plopped on my chair and brought up my computer with a flick of my hand. We kept all of our files digital, just so they wouldn't take up space. I was still learning all I could about magic. I could create my own realm if I really wanted to, but wasn't sure how sustainable that was. Allison suddenly burst into my office and shut the door behind her. She clicked the lock and turned to face me. My mouth dropped open and she held up a hand. I have the phone set to direct people to voicemail, she said. And I know you don't want to hear this. The last thing I want to do is judge you and your preference for Matlock. I understand the heart wants what it wants. But I also know that between the two of you, you're the only one that's going to hurt, General, and I can prove it. I wanted to push back against what my friend was telling me. Tell her that she had no idea what I was going through, and it annoyed me that she assumed she did. But I could see the sympathy in her eyes. That, paired with the fact that she'd left her desk, told me that this was more important than even her job. And that said a lot. How? I asked, my voice cracking on the word. I hadn't realized my throat was so raw. I'm going to scry your future, she said. Right here. Right now. My mouth dropped open. Allison had some powerful magic, but not in anything the witches and warlocks of this realm found of value, which was why she'd never gone to college. This job was everything to her. I glanced down at my desk. But isn't that risky? Yes, of course it is. But there's nothing I can do about that part. All I can do is what I can do. And keeping you from being hurt is worth it. I let out a shaky breath. Okay, I said. I shouldn't encourage her, but I couldn't help but be curious. I wanted to know how things would end between Matlock and me, because it would eventually come to an end. It had to. Allison had a piece of chalk and quickly drew something on the hardwood floor. She reached into her pockets and pulled out a couple of things, including sage and incense. She'd prepared for this. She lit the incense, breathed in the smoke, and paused. Her eyes flashed open, magic swirling in their depths. Jen, it's not going to end well for you, she said, meeting my eyes. It's only going to lead to heartbreak and bitterness for the rest of your life. I don't want that for you. Please. What do you mean, Allison? I asked. My voice was much calmer than it should have been at this moment. Tell me. Allison held up a hand and closed her eyes again. The smoke from the incense tickled my nose and my stomach turned over once more. I placed a hand over my belly, wishing it would just settle down. Was it really the food from last night that was making me sick? It didn't feel that way. But what else could it be? I mean, she said, her voice a whisper in the room, as though she was afraid someone was listening in on our conversation, even though we'd done a protection spell. Jen, this path that you're on is dangerous. I don't know how else to tell you. It's not just that your relationship with Matlock is going to end in heartbreak, it's going to end with danger. Danger? I furrowed my brows. What? I don't understand. She sucked in a breath and closed her eyes again. Then she opened them again, suddenly. Think about it, Allison instructed. You're having an affair with the man being groomed to be the next High Warlock. That's happening in less than a month, General. If someone found out, what do you think would happen? Do you think the council will be fine with your relationship? And don't tell me all High Warlocks have affairs. I don't know his fiancée, but think about what you're doing to her. I don't care about her, I said, balling my fingers into fists. I don't care about any of it. It's not fair that Matlock and I can't be together. And it infuriates me that he won't do anything about it. I wanted to throw something. I wanted to scream. Inside my head, I saw red. Allison didn't even flinch, obviously not surprised by my temper tantrum. I sure as hell was. I prided myself on always being calm and collected, but the past weeks of emotional turmoil seemed to be catching up to me. I get that, she said, her tone gentle. She reached for my hand and pried my fingers open. Genevieve, you're my best friend. I don't want anything to happen to you. But if you stay with Matlock, you won't be safe. I was able to discern the two of you had been together just by looking at you. With the magic the council has, with their powers, don't you think they'll be able to do that with Matlock? I squirmed, pulling my hand away from Allison. So what if they do? I asked, turning from her and heading to stand by my window. I crossed my arms over my chest. Maybe I want them to know. They need to realize Matlock doesn't want to play by their rules. You think they care? Allison asked. You think they care about what Matlock wants? You know he's their puppet, General, and if Matlock really cared about you, he would say something and not be afraid to risk everything for you. Before I could respond, I twisted around, dropped to my knees, and threw up in my small wastebasket. Chapter 6. I stumbled out of the building, clutching my stomach. I loved Allison like a sister, but I couldn't be around her. Not right now. My head was spinning and sweat broke out on my forehead. Maybe I was getting sick. My stomach tightened, and I suddenly realized I was due for my period. Well, actually, now that I thought about it, my period should have been last week. But it hadn't come. And I hadn't even realized it, because of everything going on with Matlock. Maybe I was late due to stress. I quickly headed home and to the bathroom, expecting to see blood on my underwear. But there was nothing. My stomach rolled again, and I swallowed down the wave of nausea that followed. The twinges in my stomach didn't feel like period cramps. Whoa, what are you thinking now? I didn't want to jump to any conclusions without the facts. But what those facts were. I let out a breath, running the details over in my mind. Matlock and I had been sleeping with each other casually the past few weeks. Closer to a month, probably. In the entire time we'd been together again, I hadn't had my period. Of course, that could be for a number of reasons. It didn't mean. Focus, I told myself. I sucked in a breath. I shook my head. Don't jump to conclusions. I inhaled deeply. Let's look at this from a rational perspective, I said out loud. My voice echoed in the small room. You've missed your period. You got sick early this morning. You have been having unprotected sex with Matlock for the past few weeks. Maybe a month. Maybe longer. I winced. I needed to check my diary. Surely I could work it out exactly. I stood up and looked in the mirror. My pale face stared back at me. To distract myself, I reached for my hairbrush, pulling it through my unruly blonde hair before beginning to braid it. But my hands trembled, so I had to tug it out, then start all over again. At the very least, I continued, forcing my hands to steady, you need to take an accurate pregnancy test so you'll know for sure. Once you rule that out, then you can try to figure out what's going on. I left the bathroom and hurried to the small library I had in my room. We had so many books and not enough space in the family room. I'd seen a spell that would give me an accurate reading, and I wanted to make sure I got it right. It took me a moment, but I finally pulled the thick book of potions off the shelf and began flipping through the pages, looking for the spell. There it is, I muttered once I saw it. I took in the words. The spell was simple enough. All it required of me was a drop of blood. I went into the kitchen and grabbed a clean knife before heading back into the bathroom. Here goes nothing, I murmured, taking the knife and pressing it to the pad of my index finger. As I did so, I recited the words of the spell. A drop of blood bubbled to the surface of my skin, and I put the knife down on the bed. I stared at my finger. Depending on whether I was pregnant or not, my blood would turn green. If I wasn't, it would remain red. I waited and waited until I watched as my blood went from red to green, which meant pregnant. Me pregnant. This wasn't. This couldn't be. I ran my fingers over my lips, my fingers trembling as I did so. This couldn't be correct. And yet, it had to be. A magic spell wasn't some dinky test humans purchased at the drugstore. Even those were almost always accurate. A magic test revealed the truth, no matter what. I was pregnant. With Matlock's child. I looked at my bathroom door. My dad wasn't home, something I was grateful for. Even though I could easily avoid them, lying wasn't something I was particularly good at, especially with my dad. So what's the next step, Melfi? That was the question. I had different options, of course. I could create a potion that... No. I wrapped my arms around myself, shuddering by the thought. Just because I hadn't wanted a baby yesterday didn't mean I would even consider getting rid of the one currently tucked away in my womb. The notion of it was unfathomable to me. I closed my eyes and imagined the child inside of me. All High Warlocks had sons when they bred with the women the council had arranged for them. For me, my child would be a girl. There would be no question of it in my mind. The real question was, did I give this child up for adoption? Or did I keep her and raise her myself? And most importantly, what did I tell Matlock? I steepled my fingers around my nose and thought hard about the complexities of my sudden situation. I was compelled to pace, so I allowed myself to follow my instincts, my hands thrust behind my back as I walked back and forth across my room. I probably shouldn't tell Matlock. After all, he was going to be the High Warlock, and having a child outside of marriage, let alone with someone who wasn't his fiancé, had to be illegal. At the very least, it wasn't going to be an ideal situation for him. Or me. But maybe. I let my voice trail off, chewing at my bottom lip. Could I even let myself hope that there was some way out of this? That there was some happy ending for us? I placed my hand on my stomach, looking down. I didn't feel any different, save for the throwing up. I didn't feel pregnant, though I didn't know what it meant to feel pregnant. But maybe, my little cricket could have a family. Maybe. The thing was, I didn't want Matlock to feel compelled to marry me just because I was pregnant. I refused to be the girl who trapped him. The witch from a different class who was looking for a way to escape her blue-collar, mundane life. If, and this was a big if, there was any way for a happy ending, it had to be earned. I would accept nothing less. I pressed my palm against the underside of my belly and rubbed it with affection. We would accept nothing less. Which meant I had to stop dicking around. I needed Matlock to prove he was in this for the long haul. And if he wasn't, well then, I would prepare for that as well. But how was I going to accomplish this? What was my plan? I stopped pacing and leaned against the wall, tilting my head back so I could stare up at the ceiling. I took a breath, and then another. Well, for one, I said, we can't tell him about you. He can't find out. That way, it's not like he can ever say I forced him to be with me. Which means, I'd appreciate it if you could not get me sick when I'm around him. I'll cut back on the sweets and the spicy foods. You keep the nausea to when he's gone, so he won't even think about the possibility of us being pregnant. Although, if he didn't think it was possible, he was an idiot. It wasn't like he was doing anything to protect himself, and I hadn't done anything to keep myself from getting pregnant. In hindsight, it was reckless, but No. No excuses. I could have, but didn't. I'd wanted to be entirely open to him. No barriers between us. But it didn't matter. The only thing that mattered was the fact that I was pregnant now. Genevieve? My gaze flicked to the door. My father had come home early. I tucked stray strands of hair behind my ear, my fingers shaking as I did so. With my father home, I couldn't hide away in the bathroom. I would have to come out and interact with the world. I would have to figure out a way to live with a baby. I'd need my own place. Because everything had changed. Just a minute. I called, and then remembered I'd enacted a privacy spell. I quickly waved it away, then called out again, just a minute. Okay. I quickly ran to the bathroom again and turned on the faucet. I ran cold water over my hands before bringing them to my face. The shock of the water woke me up, but that was the best I was going to do. Would my father be able to tell if there was something different going on? Would he be able to tell if I was pregnant? I was sure there was some sort of magic that might give him that option, but did he know how to use it? And if he did, would he? Even though he was my father, I was familiar with privacy laws, and I expected him to respect my boundaries both morally and legally. But just because he had to, didn't mean he would. And knowing I was his daughter, he might think it was his right to make sure I was safe. I wasn't sure what I would do for my child if I was in a similar situation. It was difficult for me to wrap my head around the fact that I was pregnant, that I would soon have a child relying on me. I stepped out of the bathroom, pulling my hair over my shoulder, knotting it in a braid. I walked to the dining table. I wasn't surprised to see my father already sitting down, a takeout box of styrofoam snapped open. The strong scent of spices filled my senses. Instead of salivating at the smell, I rushed to the bathroom and began to throw up. Thank goodness I made it in time. Genevieve? My father called. You all right? Shit. How was I going to explain this? I managed to glare at my stomach, as though the tiny cricket inside of me was somehow responsible for my sickness. To a degree, it was. I was just feeling betrayed because I thought we had a deal. Obviously not. I picked myself up and flushed the toilet. I needed water to rinse my mouth, so conjured it out of the air. What I didn't understand was why I'd be throwing up now, at dinner time. Wasn't morning sickness supposed to be just that? It was only then did I realize that I knew absolutely nothing about being pregnant, or being a mom, or having children. I knew about history and magic. I was one of the strongest witches in my class, and I loved learning about everything. But I was completely ignorant about this. If I was going to keep this child, and I still wanted to, then I needed to figure out how to be a good mom. There must be some sort of spell I can put on myself that will ease the morning sickness, I murmured. Conjuring up some ginger tea, I took a long sip. The hot liquid burned my tongue, but I kept drinking. I wasn't a huge fan of ginger, but already I could feel it doing wonders for my stomach. Genevieve? My father called again. I burst out of the bathroom, quickly removing the spell. I wasn't sure if my father would be able to tell I had conjured one up in the first place, but I didn't want to push it. He was just outside, poised to knock. When he saw me, his eyes filled with concern. Are you all right, Jen? He asked. At that moment, I wanted to tell him everything. I hated lying to him, keeping this secret from him, but there was nothing I could do about it. Not really. Sorry, Dad, I said. And I was. Tears pricked at my eyes and I quickly blinked them away. I sucked in a breath. It's that time of the month. And I'm a little emotional. Of course. He nodded once, not flinching at my honesty, which made me love him even more. Can I do anything for you? I just want to be alone for now, I said, but thank you. When I was safely tucked in my room, I conjured another protection spell and finally let myself cry. Chapter 7. I woke up with puffy eyes, my hand cradling my stomach. A smile lifted my lips. It seemed that even in sleep, my instinct was to protect my baby. I stared up at the ceiling, my thoughts muddled and cloudy. When I first found out I was pregnant, I was adamant about keeping the baby. But would I want the baby if Matlock broke my heart? The question itself felt underhanded and cruel. Not because of Matlock, but because my desire to have a child should not be contingent on the man who'd helped me create the child in the first place. I ran my hands through my hair and pressed my fingers to my temples. I didn't know what to do. Was this how other mothers to be felt? Surely I wasn't the only person to go through this. I wish I could talk to my mom. Granted, my problem was a little more complex than most first-time mothers, seeing as I was the High Warlock's lover and having his secret child. But then again, couples got pregnant and broke up every day. What did the women do at that point? What made them so sure about keeping their baby? I wished I had a book that could give me all the answers. First thing you can do is get out of bed, lazy ass. I told myself. I couldn't wallow. I still had to go to work. I would see Allison, so I needed to prepare myself for that as well. But what if I told her? That might actually help. Allison was my best friend. Sometimes she got in too deep with her spells, with everything going on, but she was always there for me. Most of the time, she was also right. I couldn't deny that. She would know what I should do. And maybe me being pregnant would change her ominous prediction. I threw myself out of bed and hopped in the shower. There was something cleansing about the hot water sluicing off my body. I wiggled my hips and flicked my wrists. Anything to release negative energy. I pressed my hand on the underside of my belly. It was still surreal to me to think I had a baby inside of me. Part of me was ready to take another test, just to confirm the validity of the statement. But deep down, I knew it was true. I didn't need another test. Once I finished my shower, I stepped out and dried myself off. My stomach didn't immediately twinge with need. I had no intention of throwing up, and my stomach seemed to respect that. Just to be sure, I conjured up another batch of ginger tea and took a long drink. I wasn't in the mood to eat anything, but I trudged into the kitchen and forced myself to nibble on some toast, just to have something in my stomach. After that, I headed to work. I wasn't sure what to expect from Allison today. I worried she was going to lecture me after I'd run out on her yesterday. The worst thing was, I already knew what she was going to say. She'd tell me how foolish my behavior was and that a baby wasn't going to fix things between Matlock and me. She'd give me a stern look and say I was smart enough to know better. I didn't want to be lectured. I knew what I'd done. And while I didn't think it was fair to the baby to regard the whole thing as a giant mistake, I had to take responsibility for my actions. I needed to put on my big girl pants and accept whatever judgment Allison was going to cast on me. If I needed her help, I'd suck it up. And I did need her help. When I reached work, I headed up the steps to the building, trying to ignore the bite of the autumn breeze on my face. I shoved my hands deep into my jacket pockets and headed inside where everything was warm. The tension in my body eased, but only slightly. I might have been out of the cold weather, but I was walking towards Allison. By the time I arrived at the office, Allison was already there, but because she was on the phone, I had a few minutes reprieve. "The dean has been away from his desk, but I can take a message for you," she said into the phone as her gaze connected with mine. I gave her a little wave and headed to my office, gently closing the door behind me. I looked at the stack of files on my desk that needed to be digitized today and plopped into my chair. This was easy work, way beneath my abilities. Because of my family's status, I wasn't going to get a better job, even if I was better at magic than Matlock. After a moment of feeling defeated by society, I shook myself out of the dark cloud threatening to rain on my day. Work was only going to pile up if I just sat here feeling sorry for myself. There was always something to do. I sighed and picked up a folder. I wiggled my fingers, ready to process the contents, when the door flew open. Allison stood there, her eyes immediately scanning over me as though she was checking to make sure I was in one piece. "Yes?" I drawled, setting the file back down, waiting. "How are you?" she asked. She stepped into my office, gently closing the door behind her. "You look." "I look?" I arched a brow. There was no way Allison could tell I was pregnant, could she? Then again, Allison was more powerful than even I was, at least with foresight. My skills reading the future were lacking, probably because I didn't really want to know what was going to happen. "Different." She sighed. "Jen, I'm sorry about yesterday." I shifted in my chair. "Yesterday?" I echoed. "When I basically attacked you," she said. "Where you didn't even have a chance." She began to play with a loose strand of hair. "I know I need to mind my own business. It's one of my biggest issues." "I get that." "I do. I just want you to know that I'm sorry. I care about you. You're the only friend I have." "Don't be so dramatic," I said, waving my hand at her. Her eyes widened in earnest. "No, it's the truth," she said. I'm different. My abilities are different. Not a lot of people can see into the future, and regardless of what some people think they desire, they don't want to know what's going to happen to them. Not really. She lifted a shoulder. "Why do you think I took this job? It wasn't for the money or the experience. I'm able to breathe here, you know? I don't have to talk to these voices in my head all the time." "You have voices in your head?" I teased, my lips curling into a smirk. "You know what I mean," she said. "I thought if I showed you the future, without going into detail, that it might protect you. Instead, I pushed you into a corner, and I know how you get when backed into a corner. You fight your way out. I knew better, and I'm sorry." I felt myself relax. Everything Allison said reassured me that telling her about my situation was the right thing to do. Sure, I might get a lecture about it, but maybe I needed it. "Allison, I need to tell you something." She sucked in a breath, releasing her hair and straightening. "Of course," she said. "I'm here to listen to anything." I opened my mouth to speak, then stopped and bit my lip instead. The words were frozen inside my mind. The urge to pace the length of my office was overwhelming. If I moved around, perhaps they would come. I was never one to be afraid of things, especially not words of truth, but now I hesitated. As it was, this baby was mine and mine alone. It was a secret no one else knew. Telling Allison would change that. While I trusted my friend, I wasn't sure if I wanted to involve someone else just yet. "Genevieve," Allison said, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay?" I stopped myself. How hard was it to say the words, "I'm pregnant"? Without warning, my eyes teared up and I stopped pacing. I tried to blink them away, but all that did was cause them to roll down my face and make it even more obvious I was crying. Thankfully, Allison knew me well enough not to crowd me, not to hug me. She allowed me a moment to collect myself. "Jen," she said, her voice soft. "Something is eating away at you." "What is it?" I took a breath. I needed to tell her. I couldn't hold back any longer. "Allison," I began, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'm going to tell you something, but you have to promise me you won't say anything to anyone." "I promise." I turned from the window to catch her eye. "Do you vow it?" Her eyes widened, her reaction exactly what I expected. "What is going on, Genevieve?" Allison asked. She knew I wouldn't ask for a solemn promise unless I was serious about whatever I was hiding. And I was. At least a vow would keep my secrets safe. The penalty for breaking one was pain. "Do you vow it?" I repeated. I hoped she could tell by the expression on my face I was serious about this. That I needed to hear the words from her mouth if I was going to say anything. "I vow I will not utter a word of your secret to anyone at all," she whispered. I swallowed. I placed one hand on my stomach because that seemed to soothe me now, though I couldn't explain why. "Allison, I'm pregnant." The word sent a shock through me, just saying it out loud, admitting it to someone other than myself. In that moment, I knew it was real. The test had proved as much, but I hadn't actually felt it until the words came to my lips. Her eyes widened. My goodness. She fell into the chair opposite my desk. "I'm assuming the father is Matlock?" "Who else would it be?" I asked, taking my seat across from her. She held up her hands. "Sorry," she said. "Had to be sure." She placed her hands on her thighs. "I'm not surprised." "Not exactly." She looked up at me, chewing her bottom lip. "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," I admitted, picking at the hemline of my shirt. I felt strange and unsure, two things I rarely experienced. "Well, are you going to tell him?" she asked. When I didn't answer, she squirmed to the edge of her seat. "Jen, you have to tell him. As the father, he has the right to know." I clenched my jaw. "I won't be the woman who traps him," I said. My voice was tight. But Allison was right. I should tell him. But that didn't mean I wanted to. I won't use my baby to leverage a relationship out of him if he doesn't want to be with me. Allison nodded once, then twice. "Then, what are you going to do?" I shrugged. "I have no idea. I will tell him, but only if I can trust that he wants to be with me for me. No matter the risk or the sacrifice." Do you think that will happen?" Allison asked. I blew out a sigh and answered as honestly as I could. "I don't know." Chapter 8. Deep down, I knew that Matlock had to make a grand gesture to show me that he wanted to be with me. That he would change his engagement and circumstances. But until then, I had to figure out what I was going to do with the baby, with myself, because it wasn't going to be safe for me when people found out I was carrying the heir to the council's power. Matlock would be coming home today, and he'd already sent a message. He wanted to meet up at my place. It was a risk, but my father would be working late so Matlock and I could talk in my room. It had been weeks since we'd started this relationship again, and we hadn't gotten caught yet, so I figured that that was a good sign. The day passed as slow as molasses. Once I was finally home from work, every time I heard something outside, the rustle of bushes, the wind snapping branches, I rushed to the door to see if it was him. I couldn't help it. I loved him. I always had. And knowing he was on his way to see me both thrilled me and terrified me. Ideally, I wanted Matlock and my child. To marry him, to be his wife, to have a family with him. But that was a fantasy. Allison had taught me that. And as much as I wanted to lash out and deny the truth of it, I couldn't. Which meant for Matlock and me to be together, he had to refuse the position of High Warlock. Abdicate from his bloodline, and goodness knows where things would fall. Matlock, like most High Warlocks, was the only child, only son of the previous High Warlock. Even thinking about him walking away from his birthright made me cringe. As much as I loved him, as much as I believed he loved me, I didn't think he'd be willing to give that up. I glanced around the kitchen, my stomach tightening with hunger. I wasn't sure if Matlock was going to bring over takeout for dinner, or if I should cook something. To pass the time, I decided to make something. Not by magic, but by using the ingredients from my father's garden out the back. We didn't have much of a yard, but what we did have was used for his crops. I didn't understand why he was so intent on creating one when he could magic up the freshest ingredients with a flick of his hand. But he told me there was something special about real food, nature, and respecting the earth. I wasn't much of a cook, but I tried my hand at roast beef and vegetables. I grabbed some potatoes, carrots, and onions from the garden. I would conjure up the meat and the dinner rolls, but the vegetables would be fresh, and it would take longer than a mere snap of my fingers. I didn't know how long I was working in the kitchen, but soon enough, there was a knock on the door. I jumped, surprised. I looked down at my clothes. Damn. I was still dirty. I'd completely lost track of time. I rushed to the door only to find Matlock staring down at me. It was difficult for me to interpret the expression on his face. I was too focused on making sure tonight went as smoothly as possible. Come in, I said, beckoning him forward. I just need to change. Dinner is almost ready, and my father is working the night shift, so we won't be interrupted. I quickly kissed his lips before pulling back. I missed you, I managed to say before ushering him into the dining room and gestured at the table. Please sit. I'll be right back. I practically skipped to my room. He was here. I could snap my fingers and change instantly, but I needed time to collect my thoughts. My hand went to my stomach. I touched the flatness, though whether I was reassuring baby or myself, I didn't know. I took a slow breath, then another. When my nerves finally settled down, I went through my wardrobe and found a dress that hugged my curves. I pulled it on, stepping into the only pair of heels I possessed. For my hair and makeup, I did cheat and snapped my fingers. Not because I wanted to get it over with, but because I didn't know the mechanics of makeup and hair, and I didn't want to frustrate myself before talking to Matlock. I gave myself a cursory glance in the mirror. It wasn't perfect. For one, I didn't look like myself. I didn't feel like myself. But that probably had to do with the fact that I was nervous, and I was wearing a dress. I didn't want to admit it, but tonight's dinner was a huge deal. Basically, I was going to see if Allison was right. Would Matlock do something to show me that he cared about me? I still had no intention of telling him about my child, even if Allison had suggested to do so. I understood he had a right to know. I respected that. But I also had a right to know how Matlock truly felt about me, what he was willing to do for me. I rubbed my clammy hands together. I shouldn't be nervous. I was going to learn the truth. That was what I wanted. And yet, what would I find? What if Matlock's words weren't what I wanted to hear at all? It's now or never, I muttered to myself. After taking another deep breath, I emerged from my room. One hand cradled my belly until I remembered I didn't want Matlock to know about the baby. I dropped it to my side, but strangely enough, it felt awkward there, like it was more at home on my stomach rather than at my side. Matlock sat at the table, exactly where I expected to find him. However, his hard gaze was fixed on the table, his mouth twisted into a frown. It made me stop and stare at him. What was going on with him? This was not the Matlock I knew and loved. He was never this serious, no matter what circumstances he found himself in. Hey, I said. He blinked at the sound of my voice, as though I'd snapped him out of some sort of spell. His face smoothed over, but his eyes stayed troubled. He stood up, pulling me into a hug. He lingered longer than he normally would. I pulled back so I could look at him. Matlock, I said slowly. Is something wrong? He forced a smile, waving my concern away. I tried not to take it personally, as I took a seat across from him. I snapped my fingers and the food I made appeared in front of us, the strong scent of spices filling the space between us. It smells delicious, Jen, he said as he sat back down. I made everything myself, I told him. Well, the vegetable side of things anyway. You cook? He looked like he didn't believe me. I had time on my hands during your trip, I pointed out, picking up my plate and serving myself. I'm a quick learner, if you don't remember. How could I forget? It was so simple for us to fall back into our natural rhythm, and I hated how easily I was charmed by him. It was also annoying how incredibly handsome he was. I couldn't help but wonder what our baby would look like as I stared at him. Would it get his stormy eyes? Or my hair color? I cleared my throat, forcing myself to look at the food rather than at him. Thinking about such things served no purpose at the moment. I had to be sensible. You didn't have to go to so much trouble, Jen, he said, as he piled potatoes on his plate. I knew how much he liked them, especially when they were home-cooked. I could have just grabbed takeout. I missed you, I said, as though that explained everything. And while I kept wavering about how I felt and what I should feel for Matlock, that much was true. I did miss him. And I wanted to show you that. I wished you hadn't, he mumbled. I didn't think he intended for me to hear it, but I did. I could see from the look on his face that I should let it go. I should pretend I didn't hear what he'd said and just go on chewing food that tasted like ash in my mouth. I should, but I didn't. It wasn't in my nature to let things go. Why? I asked. He looked up at me. Why what? Why wouldn't you want me to cook for you? I asked. I thought it was a way to show you I care about you. He sighed, slowly chewing the food in his mouth, trying to buy himself time. It's not that, he said after he swallowed. I appreciate this, Genevieve, I do, but... I arched a brow, setting down my fork. This wasn't how I wanted things to go. He shook his head, setting his fork down as well. Look, Jen, I've been doing a lot of thinking about you and me, and I've realized that I love you. I would do anything for you. Hell, I would marry you if I could. I held my breath. This sounded exactly like what I wanted to hear, and yet there was a hint that he was going to say more. That he was going to crush my hopes and dreams in a matter of seconds. So I waited, not interrupting. If he was going to break my heart, who was I to try and stop him? Maybe this time the pain would be just enough to force me to get over him. He reached inside his robe and pulled out a locket on a long chain. I blinked. He slid it across the table to me, the gold glimmering in the candlelight. This is for you, he said. I reached out with trembling hands and picked it up. It's beautiful. And it was. I couldn't help but lift it up and put it around my neck. A gift had not been expected. In fact, if that didn't prove Matlock's commitment to me, to us, I didn't know what did. My stomach quivered with excitement and my breath caught in my throat. I opened my mouth, ready to tell him my news, when he dropped his hand to his lap. But he said, the word like a slap to my face, it's puppy love what we have. And as much as I love you, it's not enough for me to break tradition. Everyone is counting on me, my parents, the whole goddamn realm. I won't let them down. My mouth dried. I wanted to argue with him, but I couldn't even open my mouth. I can't see you anymore, Jen, he said as he stood abruptly. I shouldn't even be here. We must forget everything. Our happiness, our future. We have to realize that what we have needs to end as though we never existed. We must move on. He swallowed. The council will destroy anything or anyone they see as a threat to that tradition. And I won't let that happen. His eyes dropped to the amulet on my neck. That looks lovely on you. He ran a frustrated hand through his hair and sighed heavily. Then he headed for the door. I heard it shut. Flinched when it did. He didn't even say goodbye. Chapter 9. Allison met me at the Black Hat Cafe the next morning. I was grateful it was Saturday, and I didn't have to show up for work. I hadn't slept. I hadn't even cried, which made everything that much worse. I wanted to cry, to release all the pain and tension breaking up with Matlock had caused, but I couldn't do it. My heart was broken. Allison found us a small table in the corner of the cafe where we would have privacy. We slid into the chairs and I grabbed a pink packet of sugar just so I could do something with my hands. You look like shit, Allison said after we ordered our drinks. I hadn't been a big fan of coffee before I was pregnant, but now the very thought of it turned my stomach. So I'd ordered peppermint tea. Thanks, I muttered. I couldn't even be mad at Allison. She wasn't wrong. I didn't even look in the mirror as I'd pulled on new clothes for the day. I wasn't sleepy, but I was exhausted. It was hard for me to explain. I take it things between you and Ma? She cut herself off and glanced around. When her eyes reached mine again, she cleared her throat. Didn't go well last night? Before I could respond, the waitress handed us our drinks and disappeared. Looking around, I saw a decent line at the counter, which was a bit of a surprise. The sweet seasonal scent of cinnamon and pumpkin mixed with cream and coffee made my mouth water. My stomach rumbled. And yet the thought of eating caused my gut to twist. I didn't understand pregnancy at all. That's an understatement, I said. Without thinking about it, I began to finger the necklace he gave me last night. I didn't mean to still be wearing it after everything that had happened, but the thought of taking it off was too much to bear. I had Matlock's child inside of me, but the locket was something tangible, something I could hold on to. Giving it up wasn't an option just yet. Do you want to talk about it? I brought my cup of tea to my lips. The truth was, I didn't want to talk about it, but I wasn't sure who else I could trust at this point. After taking a long gulp, I set the cup back down and told her about my attempt at making a meal, Matlock coming over, then Matlock leaving after breaking my heart into a billion tiny fragments. I'm so sorry, Allison murmured, reaching out to squeeze my free hand. What are you going to do? I sighed. I don't know. Allison pressed her lips together. It was like she wanted to say something, but she was holding back, debating on what she should do. I didn't have the strength in me to fight her or push for more. My stomach was turning in knots. I leaned forward, taking a deep inhale of the tea's aroma in hopes it would settle me. However, part of me was worried I would never be settled again. Come to the human realm with me, she whispered. My eyes cut back to her. What? I wasn't sure I'd heard her correctly. The human realm, she repeated. Come with me. Why would I go there? I asked. You can't do magic in the human world. And magic was my life. Technically, you're not supposed to, but that doesn't mean we can't, Allison corrected gently. I looked down at my cup of tea, wishing I knew how to read tea leaves. I should probably start learning how to do a lot of things. I don't know. My dad. I wouldn't want to leave him. He's worked so hard for me. And I've ruined myself because of this damn baby. Tears formed in my eyes and one managed to escape down my cheek. I quickly wiped them away. I would not let myself fall into a hole of self-pity. It wasn't the baby's fault this happened. Jen, Allison said in a low voice. I already have a home over there. I inherited it from my grandmother. She wasn't a witch, but my grandfather was a warlock. She kept her house and my grandfather left this realm for the human realm, foregoing all magic to be with her. You can live with me. And your father could come too, if he wanted. That was a big if. My father prided himself on pulling himself up by his bootstraps, creating his own life. He didn't take any help, even if it was offered. He was stubbornly independent. I took after him because I was the same way. However, my circumstances were different now. I could go with Allison and not hesitate because I had a baby to look after. Then again, I didn't want to leave my father. I was stuck. At least come check it out, she said. Get a vibe for it. If you don't like it, we can think of something else. That sounded reasonable. I could visit Allison's home and determine if it was a place I felt comfortable to live, to raise my child. If so, maybe I could talk to my father to find out if he was willing to come with us. And if not, at least he would know what I was up to and where I was. I would tell him the truth. When would we go? I asked. Allison grinned. Right now. I stared at her. Right now? I wasn't so sure about that. At the same time, if I wanted this to work, I needed to start making decisions quickly. My stomach wasn't going to stay flat forever. I also wanted to be prepared, which meant if I knew what was going to happen now rather than later, that would lessen the stress. Okay, I said slowly. Let's do it. Allison grinned. I finished my tea, and we left the cafe. My heart was thrumming against my chest, though I wasn't sure if it was because I was nervous or if I was excited. Probably both. I followed Allison out of the cafe and towards the council chambers. There was a portal there we could use to travel to the human realm. We just had to be careful who saw us use it. My eyes kept darting over to the council building. Part of me wanted Matlock to come out and stop me from leaving. To tell me that he missed me and that he wanted to be with me. To ask me to give everything up for him. I was weak when it came to that man. Pathetic. Even my daydreams were weak and pathetic. I shook my head. I would not allow myself the time to think about Matlock. Not when there was so much I needed to focus on, including the future of this child growing inside of me. When we reached the realm entrance, Allison took my hand and we stepped through. There was a stillness, a chill, then we were rushing through again. When we broke through to the human realm, it was difficult for me to catch my balance. Without warning, I turned and threw up on the ground beneath my feet. I'd read about portal travel, of course, but I hadn't actually experienced it. It probably didn't help that I was already squeamish. Allison said nothing, just rubbed my back until I finished. She magicked some toiletries out of thin air and handed them to me. I wiped my mouth with tissues and took a sip of ginger tea. I was getting used to the taste, even though I wasn't fond of it. Ready? Allison asked. If you need more time. I cut her off by shaking my head. I had no intention of wasting time here. I wanted to gather the information as quickly as I could, so I could make a decision. It wasn't smart for me to rush things, but at the same time, I wanted to be on the path where I knew what I was going to do once I had this child. As much as I didn't want to admit it, there was a risk having it. Good, she said. It's only a couple of blocks away. I practically sagged in relief. Despite the fact that mentally I was ready for just about anything, my stomach was not. Some of it was nerves, some of it was other things. For the most part, the less I moved, the better I felt. Regardless, I needed to see the house, especially if I was going to live there, and more importantly, if I was going to raise my child there. Allison took my hand and we headed through the streets. The crazy part of this realm were the similarities to the magical realm. There weren't warlocks and witches walking down the street, nor magic crackling in the air. But there were buildings filled with large businesses and small businesses mixed in, such as cafes and exercise studios. I was glad to see there was a park nearby, with screams and laughter emanating from the children who were playing. Good afternoon, a woman said as she and her partner passed us. I gaped after them, surprised by the kindness. I couldn't think fast enough to respond. Allison turned the corner and I followed. We were heading away from businesses and stepping into a residential area now, with houses of all different shapes, sizes, and colors lined down on a strip of land. Is this where you're going to live? I asked in a whisper. My grandparents wanted to be away from the town, she said, but not too far away in case there was an emergency or some sort of craving that couldn't be quenched with magic. We stopped in front of a house near the end of the block. It was aged, with ivy growing on the sides of it, a small brick chimney, and flowers lining the pathway leading to the door. This is it, Allison announced, sweeping her hands in front of her like she was a game show host introducing a prize. What do you think? I closed my eyes and let myself feel the place. It wasn't so much that I needed it to look nice. Magic could fix a crumbling home. Even if we were in the human realm, there was always a way. The true testament to whether I would like this place was being able to feel safe. The environment where the house was located was very important too. The land and I needed to have a good relationship. I needed to know I was safe here, that my child would be too. The breeze tickled my skin. The sun's rays coated my cheeks in warmth. The subtle scent of flowers overtook my senses. The leaves rustled. I could hear kids' laughter down the street, the squeak of bikes and the thwack of balls being kicked against the garage. A sense of clear, cool happiness flowed over me. Like water bubbling in a brook, washing away the past and opening the door to my future. I opened my eyes. It's perfect, I told Allison, my lips already curving into a smile. I would love to stay here for as long as you'll have me. She clapped. Yay, she exclaimed. It's settled. Except it wasn't. Not yet. I still had to talk to my father, and I wasn't sure how that was going to go. I ran a hand through my long hair, tugging my fingers through the tangles. What is it? Allison asked, her eyes scanning my face. There's something wrong. Your face is all. She gestured with her fingers around her own face, as though that was going to help me understand what she meant, you know. Constipated. I laughed, despite the trouble that plagued my mind. It's just, I said, crossing my arms over my chest. I don't feel comfortable putting you at risk. The truth was, I didn't feel comfortable talking to my father about this, but I couldn't tell her that. She would tell me to just trust my father. And I knew I should. I couldn't just leave him without telling him where I was going. I refused to do that. But talking to him about this was going to be difficult. He would be so disappointed in me, I was sure. But I'd have to get over it, of course. Somehow. I pressed my lips together and pushed those thoughts away. I needed to focus on the here and now for the moment. I slowly made my way up the steps of the house. Could I imagine my child playing here? Would I ever feel completely comfortable allowing him or her to be outside, alone? I didn't want to have to hide it away for the rest of its life. That wouldn't be a life for a healthy child. But I also refused to risk its safety. And I wasn't sure we would be completely safe here. Not that the human realm wouldn't normally be safe for us. A lot of warlocks and witches who were tired of their own realms and wanted to live without the watchful eye of the council lived here. And I was sure the council knew it too. They just didn't see those retreating magical figures as threats. My child, on the other hand? My child was a threat to everything. You're not putting me at risk, Jen, Allison said suddenly, taking a step towards me. I gave her a look that hopefully conveyed that I didn't really believe her. While I appreciate your kind words, I said, we both know that isn't true, Allison. I can't let myself be naive about this any longer. Maybe I was trying to fool myself before this. I glanced down, my gaze going to my stomach. But I can't do that anymore. Not with so much at stake. Yeah, but that doesn't mean you deserve to figure this out on your own, Allison pointed out. She took a tentative step towards me. I wasn't sure what she saw on my face, but she was treating me like I was a timid animal, and she was afraid that she was going to scare me. Jen, I'm here for you. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you or your child, and I could have prevented it in some way. I know, I said. But I also couldn't live with myself if I knew I dragged you into this sort of danger. This isn't your burden to bear. It's my foolishness, my mistake. I cradled my stomach. I don't think having this child is a mistake, of course. What I mean is, I was a fool. I was careless. I was selfish. I shook my head. It was odd. I felt older than I had ever felt before, and it had maybe been a few weeks since all of this happened, since my life had completely changed. My choices are my own. I don't need anyone else to take responsibility for them. I know that, Allison said. Regardless, I'm still here for you. So you might as well use me. I smiled again. Bloody stubborn, I muttered. Must be from hanging out with you too much then, she shot back. I looked back out at the yard. As much as I wanted to believe we could be safe here, I wasn't sure that was the case. The council wanted me gone. They knew about Matlock's feelings for me, or else there was no way he would have broken things off between us. But if I disappeared willingly, would that be enough for them? Or would they come looking for me? And would they try to get to Allison or my father in order to get to me? So? Allison asked, turning her head to look at me. What do you think? I wanted to tell her that this place was beyond words. I didn't care that it was old. I didn't care that vines crawled up and down the house. It was lovely, and I could see myself here with my child. But I didn't know if this location would keep us safe the way I needed it to. I think it's brilliant, I forced myself to say, beaming at Allison. I hoped she didn't notice the forced smile on my face. I hoped she didn't notice how tense I had become. Perfect, she said. Do you want to grab some ice cream or something? Shouldn't we be heading back? I asked, frowning. I wasn't sure how things worked between the human realm and the magic realm, but I was certain there was a greater chance of us getting caught if we hung out here rather than returning. Even if I wanted to stay, which I did. I doubt anyone is going to notice that we're gone, Allison said. Charity's family is having some party tonight. It's going to be huge, and everyone will be there. My eyebrows lifted. There was a gala going on tonight? If that's the case, I said slowly, my lips curving up. How can I say no? Ice cream it is. Chapter 10. The human realm had the best ice cream I'd ever tasted. Allison and I took our time walking down the street, window shopping and enjoying ourselves. There was something especially freeing about not having to worry about being caught by someone on the council or one of their guards. My face wasn't recognizable here. No one knew about my affair with the most important man in the magic realm. I could relax. Here, I was a completely normal person hanging out with my best friend. I could pretend my pregnancy wasn't an accident, but something my partner and I wanted all along. I could pretend I was part of a little family. No one paid us any mind either. We could walk up and down the streets without anyone looking twice at us. I could probably eat as much ice cream as I wanted and not be judged for it, something I might advantage of once I was showing more. Can you imagine doing this every day, Jen? Allison asked as the night wore on. There was still a small breeze that tickled the back of my neck, and I couldn't suppress a shudder as it slid down my spine. Just you and me and the little one. I smiled at the mention of my baby, placing a hand on the small curve of my stomach. I could imagine it. But I wasn't sure that was a good thing. I kept vacillating back and forth, telling myself to relax, but also reminding myself that we would never be truly safe. Even if no one knew about me, about the baby, there was always that chance the truth would come out in some form or another. We would always be looking over our shoulders. We would always be on the run, even if we were staying with Allison. And Allison? She would always be at risk, simply because of what she was doing for me. I couldn't have that on my conscience. Even if Allison insisted on helping, that didn't mean I had to take her up on her offer. This had been eating away at me for the entire length of our stay here, after we'd reached her grandmother's place for the first time. I let loose a breath. You're still upset, Allison said after a moment. I sighed. Allison could read me better than anyone. I just don't know if I'm making the right decision, I said, running my fingers through my hair with my free hand. My other hand was still holding onto my ice cream cone, careful not to let melted sweet roll down and get my fingers sticky. Don't misunderstand me, I appreciate what you're doing. But that doesn't mean I'm comfortable putting you at risk, even if you are willing. Allison looked like she was going to argue. I almost thought it would be a repeat of everything we had already discussed, and I wasn't in the mood to fight with her again. I kept going back and forth, and I hated that I couldn't make a damn decision to save my life. I might know someone who can help, she said in a low voice. I can reach out to him if you want. I wanted to argue. I wanted to ask how letting someone else in on my secret could help the situation. That wasn't going to prevent Allison from being at risk. It was only going to drag someone else into this mess, and that was the last thing I wanted. Sure, I said instead. Maybe it would appease Allison, and I could just reject the offer later. I can't talk about it just yet, she continued. I made a promise to him. But I figured this is a special circumstance. I nodded, taking another lick of my ice cream. Have you thought about telling Matlock? Allison's voice caused my shoulders to jump up to my ears, and I nearly dropped the rest of my ice cream all over the sidewalk. If that had happened, I would have killed her. What? I asked before placing my mouth on the cold treat, trying to even it out so it wouldn't spill over. Have you considered telling Matlock? Allison asked. I'm not saying it's a good idea. I just wanted to know if you had. I wanted to tell her that I tried. Actually, that was a lie. When I found out, I was going to tell him. And then he broke up with me. He threw everything we had away. He was able to move on so easily while I broke every single night on my bathroom floor, wearing one of his shirts that still smelled like him. I hated him. But I still loved him. And I hated that. I've considered it, I finally said. I couldn't meet her gaze. I decided it's a bad idea. Good. Allison settled beside me. I thought maybe. She shook her head. I didn't want to tell you, but that party tonight? It's actually, well, it's an engagement party. I just wanted you to know. I furrowed my brow. Wait, I said. You showed me your grandmother's house as a way to keep me away from Matlock? You thought I'd go to him? Honestly, I wasn't sure, she said. I wasn't sure whether I was angry or disappointed. The truth of the matter was, I wasn't sure if I should tell Matlock about my child or not. I thought that after he broke up with me, not saying anything was the right decision. But being reminded that he was off having an engagement party as though nothing was wrong boiled my blood. Why was I the one who had to be concerned about my life, my child's life, and he could go on pretending everything was okay? Because everything was not okay. And he needed to know that. Chapter 11. I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be at this fancy home in one of the most affluent neighborhoods in the realm. I was sure I'd get caught, even though I magicked myself as a waitress working at this event. I just wanted to see Matlock. I wanted to see the truth on his face about everything. I didn't think I could do this on my own, and yet, I knew I had to. But maybe if Matlock knew. Except he was the one who'd left me. He was the one who broke up with me. Being the one left behind was frustrating. But he didn't know. He didn't know about the child. I placed a hand on my stomach, leaning against the sturdy oak tree as I looked at the large house. Just feeling my stomach, reminding myself that a baby was inside of me, depending on me, reassured me more than I expected. I thought for sure I'd be running away from the responsibility. I had ever since my mother died because I knew deep down, nothing could be counted on. But knowing I was going to be a mother changed all that. It gave me confidence. More than that, it urged me to do what was right, even if what was right had nothing to do with what I wanted. Maybe if I could talk to Matlock, maybe if I could tell him about our child, he would guarantee its safety. He would make sure no harm came to it. This wasn't a ploy to get him back. I didn't think I even wanted him back, not after what he said to me. Not after what he did. Although, the more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't blame him. He was as much a prisoner of the council and their villainous ways as I was. I didn't realize that until right now, and maybe that was me, being too caught up in my own selfish wants to realize it, but I understood that now. Matlock had no control over his position. He also couldn't change the fact he would participate in an arranged marriage. The council decided everything for him. He was just a face, a puppet. But what if he came with me? What if he chose to leave? Maybe if he knew about our child, maybe then he would finally stand up to them. Or if he couldn't stand up to them, maybe he could run away. I knew it was a great risk. I doubted the council would let Matlock go so easily. His family line had inherited the position of High Warlock for centuries. If Matlock just walked away, I didn't know what that would do to everyone. But I had to try. It was easy to spot him. There was a crowd gathered around him, their faces intent on listening to one of his stories. There was a beauty about him I didn't think other people appreciated. When he weaved a tale, his entire face was animated, his eyes intense, and he gestured with his hands in a way that might cause some people to question his sanity. However, it was all part of his charm. It was one of the many reasons I was in love with him. My heart clenched. I pushed further against the tree. The white bark seemed to press back, and while it was smooth, it also wasn't exactly comfortable. Matlock stood on the grand deck of his fiancée's family home that overlooked the large backyard. A couple of guests were whispering under the moonlight, but for the most part, the majority of people in attendance were tucked inside where it was warm. I pulled down the hemline of the ridiculous waitress uniform I wore. My stomach was already growing, which meant the dress was tighter than I originally expected it to be. I wasn't sure if it was obvious of the state I was in, if people could tell I was with child, but what I wore definitely wasn't helping that one way or the other. I closed my eyes and tilted my face up. Again, I couldn't help but wonder what the hell I was doing here. This was a mistake. It had to be. I shouldn't be here. For one, telling Matlock about our child wasn't going to change things for anyone. If anything, it was going to make things worse for him, because now he knew he had a child out in the world, and that child posed a threat to everything. I didn't know why I thought this was a good decision. I pressed my hands to my stomach, tears burning my eyes. Why did it feel as though everything I did, every good intention I had, amounted to more trouble? I knew I needed to learn a lesson, and I had. My relationship with Matlock had been reckless and selfish, and now there was a child in the mix. I just wanted to do right by my child. Didn't the father deserve to know? Perhaps. But should he? I kept wavering back and forth. I knew Matlock's feelings about the council. I knew he didn't agree with them. I knew he hated that he had to give me up because of their traditions. But he still hadn't done anything about it. Would telling Matlock about my child really change anything in the grand scheme of things? No. No, it won't. You're using this as an excuse to see him again. You know you shouldn't be here. I needed to leave. I had to get away before I got caught. What are you doing here? The ultra-feminine, if slightly nasally voice filled my ears and I froze. This had to be a dream. There was no way that Charity, of all people, managed to find me. I whipped around, only to find that yes, Charity had found me. She was all jagged lines and harsh scowls, her lips curled into a sneer, eyes narrowed into tiny little slits as she glared at me. I would have been amused and proud that my mere presence could rile her up in such a way, but I could not be discovered here. Not by Matlock. Not by anyone else. And especially not by Charity. Are you seriously working our engagement party? She asked, her snide voice ringing in my ears. Then her gaze narrowed. Or did Matlock invite you? Charity asked, and there was a hitch to her voice, almost as though she was worried he had. I thought about this for a minute. I could tell her Matlock invited me. I could tell her that he wanted me to be by his side. But it would be a lie. Even though it would hurt her, and I wanted nothing more than to hurt her, seeing as how she had everything I had ever wanted, I didn't think it would make a difference. All the pettiness I yearned to participate in, all the points I wanted to make, the pain I wanted to inflict, all melted away. Charity was a bitch, but she didn't ask for this just as I hadn't. In a way, I felt sorry for her. Matlock wouldn't love her. Not like he loved me. Even watching them back when I was hungry for pain, looking for any evidence of why I was superior to her, I could clearly see there was no passion between them. And that was sad. No one should be in a passionless marriage for the rest of her life, even if she was the biggest bitch on the planet. Of course not, I said. Suddenly, Charity's lips twitched wide, smirking like a snake. That couldn't be good. I narrowed my eyes, my body tensing. I wanted to look away. I wanted to see if there was anyone else around that might have also noticed me and was closing in. Why else would she look so smug? That's right, Charity said, tilting her head forward so some of her red hair fell over her shoulder. I considered, for a moment, choking her with it, but then I really would be in trouble, and I wouldn't be able to protect my child or my father, no matter how powerful I was. Matlock dropped you like a bad habit. And you were. I'm glad he got it out of his system. Excuse me? I'd asked. I meant to keep my voice down, but the volume increased more than I would have liked. This time I did look around, wanting to make sure no one could overhear or see us. Charity kept her eyes firmly on me. She clearly didn't care one way or the other. She probably wanted me to get caught. If I were caught, then that meant I was no longer a threat to Matlock's affections. You heard me, she said. Now that he slummed around with an unimportant peasant and sowed his wild oats, as the humans say, he can focus on what's important, building a family with his wife. Remind me if I'm mistaken, I said, and I could very well be, but you aren't his wife yet, are you? He might have been slumming it with me, as you've stated, but he's enjoyed me in ways you'll never get to enjoy him. I clicked my tongue against the back of my teeth. How sad for you. I cocked my head to the side. You see, Chastity. It's Charity, she corrected through a growl. Whatever. I didn't care. There are things he's done with me that he will never do with you. Sex is not the most important thing in a relationship, she said, though I could tell I was starting to get to her. Good. Sex? You think I'm talking about sex? I shook my head, hoping it came across as condescending, because it was. I'm not. I'm talking about love. You think he loves you? He doesn't. He loves me. The only reason he's with you is because he has to be. I shook my head. You know what, Chastity? I feel sorry for you. How does it feel to know that you'll never be truly loved by him? You'll always be the girl he was forced to be with. I knew I wasn't being fair. If anything, she was in the same situation he was in. That wasn't her fault. The fact that she was gloating about it pissed me off, though. The fact that she didn't seem perturbed in the slightest. That she wanted Matlock, even if it was in this way. Maybe she doesn't even want him. Maybe she wants the power, the title. Maybe he's nothing to her. I think it's time you go before you do something stupid and cause a scene, Charity said, her voice deadly and low. Who knows, maybe they'll see you as a threat and hurt you. I'd like to see that. My hand dropped and I almost touched my stomach. Almost. I realized that what I was doing was stupid. I was putting myself, and more importantly, my child, at risk, all because Allison wanted to keep me from here. I was behaving like a child. I'll leave, I said through gritted teeth. My pride was already wounded, but it would seem that didn't matter. There were still parts of me too stubborn to care. Are you sure? We were just getting to know each other? I wanted to punch the wicked smile off her pretty face. Instead, I stepped back and left. I didn't turn back. I knew Charity wasn't going to do anything to me. I managed to make it to the next block before the tears started to come. I quickly wiped them away, refusing to shed a tear for Matlock. Not again. Genevieve, a harsh voice called out. I straightened. I had wanted to avoid him after everything. I closed my eyes, tried to press against the wall. But it was no use. He'd caught me. Chapter 12. Oh no. It's him. Graham. My voice was barely a whisper. I wasn't sure if he heard me, then he stilled. I'd wanted to avoid seeing Matlock because it hurt too much, and I felt like such a blasted fool for even coming here in the first place, but now I was trapped and had no way out. I should have known I would get caught. I should have known that this was going to happen. Who did I think I was, trying to see Matlock at his own engagement party? Was I really that stupid? Maybe it's pregnancy brain, a voice in my head pointed out. I've heard that renders even the brightest women stupid. Magic tickled my fingers as though to remind me it was there in case I needed to use it. As much as I appreciated the sentiment, the last thing I needed to do was use magic on a junior council member. I didn't want anyone discovering my and Matlock's previous relationship, although, based on what Charity said, it seemed that they were aware of it, even if they hadn't taken action. I was through. This time, I was sure of it. I did feel guilty, of course. Part of me was so sure that Matlock had a right to know about our child, about the small family we had created together, but then I remembered his eyes as he broke up with me. I remembered how cold and unflinching he was. Why had I even bothered to come? Why would I put myself at such risk? I didn't want to involve myself any further with the council, with Matlock, with any of it. And after Allison's offer of finding someone who could help us so she wouldn't be at risk, I had a lot to think about. Genevieve Melfi, Graham said, his voice a slice into my skin. How interesting to run into you only a street away from Matlock's engagement party. What risk you've taken coming here. And now you've gone and gotten yourself caught. He sneered. Stupid wench. I swallowed, glancing past Graham to the other side. A bird flew past but didn't even turn his head to look at me. Why would he? There were people there, but they didn't notice us. I could hear laughter and subtle conversation coming from the surrounding houses. Had Graham conducted some sort of invisibility spell so no one would see the two of us down here? If I screamed, would Matlock recognize my voice and come for me, or would he ignore me? Would he pretend he was not aware of what was happening? If Graham had done such a thing, why? What were his plans for me? No way, I thought. There's no way Graham is that stupid. Maybe if I deserved it. Maybe if there was actual evidence of the affair Matlock and I had, like the child growing inside of me, and Graham knew about it, then maybe. But no one knew about that. No one except Allison. And I knew Allison would never betray me. I don't know what you're talking about, I forced myself respond. He was waiting, and I was sure his head was spinning with possibilities about why I was being silent when I typically spoke without thinking much about it. His sneer only grew, marring what might have been considered a handsome face. I think you know exactly what I'm talking about, he said. I swallowed. It took everything inside of me to refrain from holding on to my stomach, protecting my baby. More magic surged through me. I hoped he couldn't tell. I didn't want him to think I was protecting myself for some reason. He'd become more suspicious than he already was. I didn't know if he was referring to the affair I'd had with Matlock, or if he actually knew about my pregnancy. Or he could be talking out of his ass. Council members tended to do such a thing more often than not, so I wouldn't be surprised. But I couldn't assume anything. I couldn't take the risk. I had to pretend to be stupid. No one could find out about my baby. No one. And even if he suspected, I couldn't give him the benefit of knowing the truth. What do you want? I asked, forcing myself to sound more confident than I actually felt. I cleared my throat and stepped forward. Maybe if I pretended not to care, pretended nothing was wrong, I would start to believe it. I'm guessing this is a serious conversation, or you wouldn't have cast a protection spell, so no one can see us or listen in on our conversation. That was for your protection, Graham said. My protection? I furrowed my brows. The bit of bravery I managed to muster shifted. I don't understand. The council doesn't know about you and Matlock, Graham said, but I do. I wasn't going to rise to his bait. I would wait and see what he really knew. I knew it from the second we ran into you a couple of months ago on the street, Graham continued, shifting his weight. The council knows about the relationship you had before, when things ended the first time. They know you have the ability to bring out the worst in him. Worst is matter of opinion, I said. I felt myself relax, albeit slightly. At the very least, he didn't know about the pregnancy. That was all I cared about. My relationship with Matlock was over. Matlock can be free with me in a way he can never be as High Warlock with your precious council. Your council too, Graham reminded me, sticking out a finger and pointing it at me. As long as you're in this realm, you answer to them, just as I do. Just as Matlock does. You may think you're above it, but you aren't. I snorted. A breeze stirred up, causing me to shift with obvious discomfort. Why are you here, Graham? I asked, furrowing my brow. What do you want? I'm here to warn you away from Matlock, he said. He's been sad the past couple of days. I'm assuming the two of you stopped seeing each other? I pressed my lips together and clasped my hands together in front of my dress. I wasn't going to admit anything to him. I'm going to take your silence as affirmation, he said. He began to pace back and forth, hands thrust behind his back. It almost felt as though I wasn't in his thoughts anymore. Which meant if I tried to leave, he would let me. I took a step, hoping to ease out of the alley. I didn't like that no one could see me or hear me. He could do harm to me and no one would know. He snapped his head up at my movement. Where do you think you're going? He asked. Back home, I said slowly. Why are you even here? He glanced around. This isn't where your home is. This isn't where your work is. You know where I work? I know everything about you, he said. I know a couple of days ago, you visited the human realm. I slowly curled my fingers into tight fists, trying not to react. I didn't want him to know he was right, even though he was. I didn't want to give him the satisfaction of shaking me to my core. Instead, I exhaled deeply through my nose. What were you doing there? He asked. I thought you knew everything, I retorted. It probably wasn't the most appropriate time for me to be sassy, but I couldn't help it. Graham was older than me, more intimidating. I knew the type of person he was. He wasn't afraid to bully others in order to get exactly what he wanted. He wasn't above doing what he had to in order to accomplish his goals. At least, that was what Matlock had told me, and I believed him. It bothered me, knowing that Matlock could still go out with him, socialize with him like they were friends. Didn't Matlock care that he was hanging out with the type of person who would screw him over in a heartbeat if it benefited Graham in some way? Didn't that mean anything to Matlock? Not that I cared anymore, I reminded myself. It didn't matter. Matlock could do whatever he wanted, and I would just have to learn to accept it. If all went well, I wouldn't be around to know what that was. I would be tucked safely away in the human realm. Did anyone ever tell you your mouth is going to get you in trouble someday? Graham asked. His gaze dropped to my lips and narrowed. I wouldn't say it made me feel slimy, because I don't think that was the purpose of his stare. What I did know was there was hatred in his eyes, like he was upset with me for some odd reason. I know all about its effects on our dear Matlock, though. Perhaps you could show me what you do to ensnare him, and maybe then this will be easy for you. My body tensed. I knew exactly what he meant by that, and I did not appreciate it. I knew better than to raise my hand to a junior council member, but I would protect myself and my baby if he thought he could away with doing something to me I did not consent to. His lips curved up into a grin. It scared me how the smile didn't touch his eyes. They were void of anything save for contempt. He wasn't a happy person. Hell, I wouldn't be surprised if he'd never known happiness at all. I almost felt sorry for him. At the same time, this was the life Graham had chosen for himself. This was what he so badly wanted. If he couldn't handle it, that was on him. Are we finished with our conversation? I forced myself to ask when Graham continued to stare at me. Whatever he was thinking, it wasn't good. If so, I have somewhere I'm expected to be. His lips twitched up in amusement, as though he knew I was bluffing. Is that so? He asked. It certainly isn't with Matlock. The two of you are over. I rolled my eyes. You already know that, I said. I wasn't going to let him goad me into a stronger reaction. Maybe the old me would have taken the bait. But now that I was pregnant, now that I had someone counting on me for protection, I couldn't lash out the way I used to. I had to think rationally. At least I had to try. I'm meeting a friend who is not Matlock. I want nothing to do with him anymore, so if you're here warning me against him, let me save you the trouble. I have no intention of being with him now, or ever again. This much was true, but it didn't stop the pain of my heart breaking as I said it aloud. At least Graham couldn't read my true emotions. The last thing I wanted was for him to know that I still loved Matlock, and probably always would. Really? He furrowed his brow. Why is it hard for me to believe you on this matter? I don't know, I said slowly, but it's true. So it worked, he murmured, more to himself than to me. He turned his back towards me, but I knew better than to attempt to leave again. Instead, I sighed dramatically, rolling my eyes to the sky until I registered his words. What worked? I knew I shouldn't have asked, but I also couldn't help it. My curiosity had gotten the better of me. I didn't want to be with Matlock, that much was true, but that didn't mean I was okay with being manipulated. He glanced over at me, a wrinkle marring the perfect bridge of his nose. It's nothing for you to concern yourself with, he said. Council business. You mentioned something worked in regard to me, so I would say that that was my business, I pointed out. Fine, Graham said. He turned so he faced me once again, but stepped closer until we were less than a foot apart. I knew what he was trying to do, but I refused to let him intimidate me. You want to know? I'll tell you. Matlock was instructed to stop seeing you. If he didn't, things would happen. Bad things. What, like him getting stripped of his title? I asked. I didn't see how that was much of an issue, although I knew that would devastate Matlock. No. Graham shook his head. More along the lines of hurting you and your loved ones. Your friend Allison, right? The one you work with at the college? And let's not forget dear old Daddy. I swallowed. What are you saying, Graham? I asked. My voice dropped considerably. I'm telling you, Genevieve, that if you do anything that would threaten our traditions, you and your loved ones will pay the price, he said. Stay away from Matlock or else. Chapter 13. Graham's words reverberated through my head over and over again. I couldn't get them out even as I went home, even as I showered the day off. I couldn't let anything happen to my father, which meant I couldn't take him to the human realm with me. And I definitely couldn't tell him about my child. It was too risky. I had already decided that when I was in the human realm with Allison, but this affirmed it. The inability to make concrete decisions was no longer possible. I couldn't continue to play games. I had to make choices, no matter how difficult, and once made, I had to stick with them. Not like tonight when I went back on my decision not to tell Matlock anything. Look at how that turned out. I very well could have done a lot more damage to myself and to my child, not to mention my father and Allison. The hot water sprinkled onto my back, steam rising to the ceiling, coating my skin in warmth. It did very little to soothe me. I tried to think of solutions, but there was nothing in my brain that was giving me a good reason. In order to ensure my father's safety, I had to keep this from him, even though that was the last thing I wanted. I wanted to be honest with him. I wanted him to know the truth. Tears stung my eyes as I stepped out of the shower. The water turned lukewarm and my skin was turning wrinkled anyway. I could have magicked it so it stayed hot, but I couldn't keep avoiding my dad. I had to face him at some point. I toweled off and put on the fuzzy pajamas I always wore when it was especially cold. This time, they brought me little comfort. When I stepped out of the bathroom, I turned down the hallway and headed for my room. Though I knew I would have to interact with him at some point, I'd hoped that wouldn't be just yet. Perhaps if I got a good night's sleep, I would be better at making decisions. At least I hope to make smarter ones. Genevieve? My father called, probably from the living room. I froze. I wasn't expecting him to be here when I got out. He didn't come home until later, unless I'd lost track of time because everything was a mess. I slowly opened my eyes and cocked my head to the side. Maybe if I didn't say anything, he would think I went to bed too quickly to hear him call me. Can you come here? I'd like to speak to you for a moment. A beat. I know you're down the hall, darling. I may be old, but my hearing hasn't left me yet. I held my breath, my eyes going wide. What could he possibly want to talk to me about? I was almost frustrated with him. How many opportunities did he have to talk to me before all of this? And he chose now as the perfect moment? Granted, I knew he had to work. That wasn't his fault. But still, I thought fate was playing tricks on me with the timing of all of this. I blew out a breath, racking my mind over the last couple of days, poring over my every word to him, my every movement. There was nothing I'd done that would clue him in to what was going on. At least, I didn't think there was. I had taken every precaution. My heartbeat pounded in my ears as I moved down the hall and stepped into the living room. There was no point in running. Even if I turned and scurried to my room and shut the door, he'd follow until we had whatever discussion he wished to have with me. I emerged from the hallway only to find my father on the couch, a newspaper in front of him, glasses perched on his nose, legs stretched out. He looked like he'd just gotten home from work, which he probably had. The sight of him there, so normal, so trusting, caused my heart to clench. I nearly doubled over just because of how painful the guilt was as it gnawed at my chest. I didn't like keeping things from him. We were the only family we had. Secrets weren't allowed between us. And then Matlock happened. Granted, my father knew about me and Matlock, but I didn't want to tell him anything more than that. Couldn't. "Hi, Daddy," I said, hovering in the entranceway. I felt like I was about to get the biggest lecture of my life, though I wasn't sure why that was. He smiled at me, though it was strained when he noticed I wasn't going out of my way to move further into the room. "Darling," he said finally. "Are you all right?" I blinked. That wasn't what I was expecting. Which was strange because I knew my father cared about me. I knew he noticed things I rather would have him not notice, but he did anyway. I should have expected that he would check in on me, and after the last couple of days I just had, that caused my heart to squeeze painfully with guilt. I wanted to tell him so badly. But I also didn't want him to even have a hint that something was wrong. I wouldn't risk him. "I'm fine," I insisted, perhaps too strongly. I cleared my throat, trying to steady myself. I wasn't going to get anywhere if I made it obvious that something was wrong. I swallowed, deciding to try again. "I'm fine, Dad. I promise." I added a smile, hoping that was enough to appease him. "Come over here." He tilted his head in my direction, and I sucked in a breath once again. Rarely did my father ever call me in for a talk. This couldn't be good. I tried to gauge his reaction as I made my way over to him, but I couldn't get a good read on him. It wasn't that he was guarded or trying to keep anything from me. At the same time, besides a gentleness that was usually always there, I couldn't be sure whether he believed me or whether this conversation was because he noticed something recently or because he just wanted to check in on me. Maybe that wasn't why he wanted to talk, though. Maybe the council had approached him. Maybe they were trying to get information out of him. Maybe they told him everything, and now he was here, trying to get information out of me. I inhaled deeply, attempting to steady myself. One hand went to cup my stomach. His eyes pointedly dropped to my hand, and I quickly pretended I was scratching myself before dropping my hand to my side. "He's here," I told myself. "Unharmed." If something had happened, maybe it wasn't as bad as I initially assumed it would be. Maybe I was making a bigger deal of this than I should be. When I reached him, he patted the seat next to him on the couch. I sat down on the edge, not quite comfortable, my back rigid. I wanted to see where this was going, and yet I wanted to take control of the conversation so I knew what to say, how to respond. He twisted his torso to face me, one arm resting on the arm of the couch, the other tossing the newspaper onto the coffee table. Whatever we were about to discuss, he wanted to make sure it had my full attention. "Is everything okay?" he asked again in a gentle voice. My heart stuttered. He never asked if I was okay. There was this unspoken rule we had between us: we wouldn't talk about emotional things unless we wanted to. That meant that unless I went to him with my problems, he wasn't allowed to ask, and I had to do the same. It was why I didn't know if we were tight with money or if he gotten the job he wanted. There were times I absolutely hated being ignorant about what was indirectly affecting my life, but I respected the boundaries the two of us had carved out between us. And now here he was breaking through those boundaries. Why wouldn't they be? I asked, hoping my voice wasn't as shrill as it sounded. I clasped my hands together and forced them into my lap, trying to keep myself from fidgeting. He'd be able to read my discomfort easily. He arched a brow, a knowing glimmer in his eyes. He sighed. "You're answering my question with a question," he pointed out. "That's not good." "Dad," I said, dropping my gaze to my lap. I clenched at my fingers, ignoring the way my skin pinched and the pressure on my bones. I wish I had sat on them. I didn't want him to see me tugging at my fingers, playing with my nails. He would know I was hiding something from him, and if he knew that, he'd be able to push harder, and it would be increasingly more difficult to keep it from him. Nothing is wrong. I have a lot on my mind. "I know you've been seeing Matlock," he said, the words tight, like he didn't want to have to say them at all. I didn't want to say he sounded disappointed, because I wasn't sure if that was the case, but the truth of the matter was, that was how I took it. I clenched my teeth together. I wouldn't react, but what could I do? How could he know? How long had he known? And if he knew that, what else did he know? Did he know we hooked up here? Did he know I was pregnant? Did he know I was planning to leave? Did he know that I didn't have any idea what I was going to do at this point? Part of me hoped he was aware of everything so I wouldn't have to talk to him at all, but he could still tell me what to do. Suddenly, I wished I hadn't insisted on being so terribly independent. I didn't want the responsibility of making my own choices. I wanted him to tell me what to do, and then I could not worry as much anymore, because he always knew the right course of action. "Well?" my father asked, not unkindly. "Do you want to talk yet?" "Where is this coming from?" I asked. I tilted my head away from him, still not able to meet his eyes with my own. I couldn't just answer his question. I would tell him no, and not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. Not yet, anyway. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. His voice was quiet. There hung the bitter sound of disappointment. He wasn't bitter, I was. Because I hated that sound. I hated it, coming from him. I hated it all. Because that's not what we do. I exploded, throwing my hands out and forcing myself into a standing position. It was as though all my stress and frustration burst out of me like water from a cracked dam. I shouldn't be taking it out on my father. He'd done nothing wrong. But even though I knew this, I couldn't stop the words from coming. Because I had bottled them up for too long, and I just needed to get them out of me. We don't talk about anything. We don't even talk about Mom. My hands dropped to my stomach, and the love I felt for this child I couldn't even hold exploded through me so suddenly that I wasn't sure how to handle it. My breath was ragged and I pressed my lips together. I wanted to tell him everything. But I couldn't be that reckless. I couldn't slip up. He sighed. He must have been focused so intently on what he wanted to discuss that he wasn't really listening to the words coming out of my mouth. Which wasn't necessarily a bad thing. "I'm not here to talk about your mother," he said, rubbing the bridge of his nose. I'm here to talk about you. That was worse. Gods, why was this going worse than the way I wanted it to go? Than the way I needed it to go? Why can't we talk about what I want to talk about? I asked. I wasn't trying to be selfish. I wasn't trying to make this about me. Well, no, that was a lie. I was. Because it never had been before. Why do we talk about what you want to talk about? Why can't we talk about Mom? I didn't know why this was so important to me, but it was. If my own mother could be so terrible to me, would I be terrible to my child? The thought scared me more than I was willing to admit. I'd already put my child at risk by going to that stupid party. That was selfish. That was careless. Would I do it again? Would I put my baby at risk for my only selfish needs? If you want to talk about your mother, we will, my father said, his voice tentative. But I want to talk to you first. About you. About your relationship with Matlock. My heart was still hammering, ready for a fight. But when he looked at me, I saw the concern in his eyes and I instantly deflated. How could I argue with him when all he wanted was the best for me? My issues with me not having a mom growing up had nothing to do with me as a mother. At least not right in this moment. My father had done everything he could to make sure I had every opportunity in the world, access to the best education, a job so I could earn money for myself, a parent who was as present as he could possibly be, especially after my mother had died. He was doing everything for me, for us. And I was ready to repay him with an argument about someone who hadn't mattered for years? What did that say about me? I took a breath, then another. I needed to calm down. What do you want to know? I asked. I picked at my pajama bottoms, tracing a small line across my knee. My skin tingled, whether it was because of my touch or because of my magic, I didn't know. Do you love him? I glanced up at my father. There didn't seem to be any judgment on his face, nothing that would indicate he was getting ready to criticize me. Instead, his face looked open. Not exactly earnest, but enough to be interested. Caring. Like, he genuinely wanted to know. We aren't together anymore, Dad, I said, dropping my gaze back to my lap. It hurt to get the words out, but they made me strong. Fierce. Saying them out loud, hearing myself say them, was like cold water slapping my face, waking me up from a dream I had grown out of. We got back together for a while, but we aren't anymore. Again. He seemed to take this information in for a moment. That's not what I asked. He placed his hand over mine, stilling my movement. I asked if you loved Matlock. Why do you want to know that? I asked. What did that even matter at the end of the day? Because I want to understand you, he said. I want to understand what you're going through. I opened my mouth. I wanted to tell him there was nothing to understand. I was a young adult, going through my own issues. Boys were the most important thing, except that wasn't true. I knew that wasn't true. Matlock meant nothing compared to my child. But there was more to it than that. Other women in their 20s weren't being threatened by junior council members. Before I knew it, my eyes pinched with tears and I sucked in a sharp breath. I didn't want to lose my grip on myself. To start bawling like some sort of toddler who couldn't control her emotions. But I couldn't help it. I wasn't able to blink them away. In fact, the blinking only encouraged the tears to start. They rolled over my cheeks freely, coming down with the force of a waterfall. What had gotten into me? Why was I even crying? Was I sad or was this some hormonal thing I couldn't control? Oh, Pumpkin, come here. He opened his arms and I went to him. It was the one place I still felt safe, regardless of everything I was going through. He rubbed my back as he held me, murmuring things like everything would be okay and that he was always here for me. It only made me cry harder because the truth of the matter was, things weren't going to be okay. The last thing I want to do is upset you, he said, kissing the crown of my head. More than anything in the world, I just want you to be happy. I know. I sniffled, pulling back slightly so I could see him. I know you do. And it seems to me, he continued, his voice tentative, that you haven't been happy lately. I can't help but wonder if it's because of Matlock and your relationship with him. He paused, waiting for me to respond. My gut twisted with guilt. Why was it so difficult for me to talk to him, to tell him the truth? Graham's face floated in my head and I swallowed. I couldn't risk giving my father all the details, but I could tell him some things. He deserved that, at least. Matlock and I started seeing each other again, I admitted, playing with the edge of my sleeve. But we stopped. It was a mutual decision, kind of. I didn't even know if I was making sense. I wanted to pick at my locket, to feel how comforting it was in my fingers, but I didn't want to draw attention to it. My father wouldn't notice it hung underneath my pajamas, but he would if I pulled it out and began to play with it. It was the only secret I had. Not even Allison knew. Part of me wished it were possible to take a piece of Matlock, the one who was free, who could love me without worrying about the consequences, and place it in this locket and keep it with me always. So we stopped, I said. And that's why I've been feeling sad lately. Sorry. No, honey, don't apologize. How did you know about my relationship with Matlock? I asked. I was approached today by a member of the council who told me that you were treading a dangerous line that could be viewed as a threat to them, he said. They said you weren't respecting tradition, and if you weren't kept in check, you would be deemed a traitor. You and your loved ones would be penalized accordingly. Which meant him. Allison. My mouth dropped open. The council was threatening him, even though Graham knew Matlock and I weren't together. I'm so sorry, Dad, I said. I was being selfish. Matlock and I are done. For good. There's no need to apologize, he told me. You followed your heart. I did the same. I understand. We just have to move forward now. I nodded, but I wasn't sure how that was going to be possible. Later, when I was alone, I called Allison and told her everything that had happened. Can you meet me at the cafe? She asked. I did. It was late and my father was sleeping, but I didn't care. I needed to fix this. I needed to make sure I could protect everyone and hope that I hadn't sealed a death warrant the second I let Matlock walk me home that night. When I saw her, she came straight over to me. We need to go see someone, she said. Who? His name's Ranger, she said. He'll be able to tell us what to do. I nodded and followed my best friend, hoping she had a way out of this maze of daggers in which I'd found myself. Chapter 14. I didn't know to whom my friend was referring, but I had to trust her. As much as I wanted to just go with Allison and stay with her in the human realm like we'd planned, it wasn't far enough away. There was too much risk to her, too. I doubted it would be difficult for them to track down Allison's grandmother's place, especially since it was pretty well known that Allison and I were best friends. If both of us suddenly disappeared, it wouldn't be long before we were discovered. I couldn't have that on my conscience. I also couldn't be worried about Allison when I was worrying about the safety of my child. Maybe that made me selfish, but I didn't care. By telling my father about the threat, Graham wanted to make sure I knew they could get me anywhere, even if I went to a different realm. Which meant my baby and I were at risk. Not only us, but Allison and my father too. The problem was, I wasn't sure what to do instead. I could just leave, of course. Run away and leave everything behind. And that might protect my father and Allison, but it would do nothing for me and my child if I didn't have some kind of plan, a way for the two of us to survive. Allison took me to a part of the magical realm that was filled with working-class homes. Compact neighborhoods with 2-story townhouses and minimal backyards. They were all the same architectural design, all the same color too. I'd never been here before, though I was familiar with the type of area. It was the sort of place you pretended you weren't from. It was a step up from poor, which, in comparison to almost anything else, was still poor. At the same time, there was a sense of pride, being from this place, that was difficult to define. There were chips on shoulders and harsh tones, but coming from the hard-working class, having calloused hands and jaded eyes was something many people here were proud of. I had no idea what to expect from this ranger person. Hell, I wasn't even sure if he would help. But it was something. And maybe that was enough for now. We headed up the steps to a door with a black number 3 on it. Allison knocked and stepped back. I shifted my weight. I wanted to open my mouth and ask her for more information. Ever since we'd started walking, she'd been silent. I didn't want to push her because I had my own thoughts to contend with, so I said nothing. But now, her silence felt more ominous than I cared to admit. Why had she never told me about Ranger before? Why did she know him? What else did she know about that I didn't? I internally shook my head. Those were things that weren't important. Not right now, at least. After a moment, the door cracked open. I couldn't make out who opened it, though I tilted my head and tried to. Only shadows caught my gaze, which I doubted was a good sign. Allison? A low voice asked. If I had to guess, a male. What are you doing here? He continued. Who are you with? Ranger, this is important, Allison said. Can we come in? He hissed at the sound of his name, and I realized Allison probably wasn't supposed to have spoken it at all. Especially not around a stranger like me. I held my breath. For a moment, I thought he was going to refuse us. Tell us to get lost, and maybe even rip into Allison for bringing me here in the first place. He did hesitate, but just barely. Without saying anything, he stepped back. Relief touched Allison's features, softening them slightly, which meant that she hadn't been sure what to expect either. I passed him, and from my peripheral vision, I saw him muttering something under his breath. At first, I thought it was some sort of incantation, and I whirled around, holding up my hand and jerking back, afraid he was going to, I didn't know what. But I couldn't ever be sure about anything anymore. Whoa, he said. Jumpy. My hand found my stomach again. What were you muttering? Why? He narrowed his eyes. I don't know who to trust, I admitted. And yet, you're desperate enough to come here? Ranger flicked an extra deadbolt and locked the door. He even twisted the doorknob to make sure everything was in place. Jen, Allison said, still speaking in a low voice even though we were tucked inside, this is Ranger. We can trust him, I promise. Ranger, this is Genevieve, my friend. The one I was telling you about. I raised my eyebrows at her. What exactly had she told him? I trusted Allison, I did, but I didn't need her saying anything about my situation. The less people who knew, the safer it was for everyone. I didn't need to suddenly feel responsible for this guy on top of my dad, my child, and Allison. That was a lot of pressure to handle. Fear itched at the back of my neck. What was I doing here? What was I doing at all? I wanted to do was the best thing for my child. I just didn't know what that was, and I hated that because usually, I was in control of everything. I glanced over at Ranger, trying to get a feel for him. The guy had shoulder-length brown hair, a smooth light brown complexion, and dark eyes. He tied his hair into a ponytail at the base of his skull, as he led the two of us into the living room. I wished my magic could read him without putting myself at risk. As it was, I was putting complete faith in Allison. If my friend trusted him, I should be able to. Allison wouldn't put me and my baby at risk. I knew that much. This is our heartbreaker? He asked in a smooth voice once he stepped inside. I would have fallen for that charm once upon a time. And he called me a heartbreaker? But that was another world, another girl. I shot Allison a look. She had told him about my relationship with Matlock? I knew that was a bit of a leap in logic, but I wasn't stupid. And I couldn't believe she would do such a thing, especially after I was so damn certain she wouldn't betray me. Are you serious right now? I asked through gritted teeth. The last thing I wanted to do was make a big deal about this, but I was already stressed enough as it was, especially after what my father had told me. The more people who knew about the situation, the more at risk we all were, especially my child. The only reason I was even here was because I wanted to mitigate everyone's risk. Why would you tell him? Allison didn't seem perturbed by my outburst. I wasn't sure if that upset me more or if I was grateful she wasn't taking my conniption personally. She held up a hand, which definitely did nothing to calm me down. Maybe she should take it more personally, because she sure as hell didn't look as though she cared in particular at this moment. I know you're probably really angry with me right now, and you have every reason to be, she said. But Ranger is extremely powerful. He'll know how to help us. Yeah, and what will he ask for in return? I asked, drawing out the sound of my voice. I crossed my arms over my chest. It was as close as I could get to my child without acknowledging that I had one. Ranger might come from the working class, but there was something sharp and intelligent about him that not even members on the council possessed. He took in every movement I had, calculated the information, stored it away for later. Depends on what I'm doing for you, sugar, he said, flashing me a smile, dimples on full display. But I assure you I'm a fair man. I won't ask you for more than what you can give. I ignored the fact that he was talking to me, keeping my focus on Allison. We can trust him? I asked doubtfully. That was the part one couldn't be sure of. I knew Allison didn't talk to anyone unless she trusted them, but just because she had faith in him didn't mean I had to. There was more than just me involved. Yes, Allison said. He hates the council as much as we do, if not more. I looked at Ranger, still not sure I believed Allison. He cleared his throat, reaching up to cup the back of his neck. There was a hard look on his face, one that said he had his own experience with them. I believed that. I could feel the anger roll off him at the mere mention of them. But that didn't equate into immediate trust. None of us had sat down yet. We were all lingering near the edge of the furniture, but I had no idea what we were waiting for. I wanted to sit. My feet ached. I wasn't sure if it was because all of the moving around I'd been doing recently, or if it was because of something pregnancy-related. I'd read in a book that ankles swelled up, but I couldn't remember when that actually started happening. I'm gay, he said. My eyes widened. Not because I had a problem with it, but because he seemed comfortable enough to announce it. Also, because he had been so charming, I never would have thought. Not that gay people couldn't be charming. They obviously could. He just seemed interested. If that made any sense. Then again, maybe I just thought he was. And the council found out, he continued. I was a junior council member when I was still in school. I had a good family, good prospects. The world was at my feet. I had a job lined up, had a way to network from my position in the council. At the time, I was seeing a guy. Cliff. I wasn't hiding it. I'd always known who I was, and I wasn't ashamed of myself. I wasn't going to let anyone dictate who I dated. The council didn't really care either, up until they realized how serious I was about Cliff. He began to pace, and I took that as a sign that I could sit down and rest my weary feet. I rolled my ankles, tilting my head up so I could look at him while he spoke. This must not be an easy story for him to tell, and I wanted to be respectful, but I also knew I wouldn't be able to give him my full attention if my thoughts were solely on my feet. And just to give you the full context, he said, the words tumbling out of him quickly, when I say serious, I mean I was ready to marry the guy. And I knew Cliff felt the same way about me. We loved each other in a way I'd never experienced before. See, the council didn't care who I was sleeping with or dating, just as long as they got to dictate who I was going to marry. They wanted to keep me on a leash. At the time, they thought I was experimenting, having a meaningless fling that would eventually burn out. They were wrong. He stopped to catch his breath, reaching up to tug at the ponytail. When I told them so, they came to me with an ultimatum. I could continue on the path that I was on with accolades, awards, the royal treatment, as royal as a council member could get, I should say. But I would have to dump Cliff, and not just dump him, but cut him off completely as if he'd never existed. I wasn't allowed to talk to him, nor acknowledge him on the street. I couldn't even admit we'd had a relationship. If I agreed to that but went behind their back and still saw Cliff, they would remove him from my life. Remove him? I repeated, my words soft. That sounded like what Graham said to me when he was talking about my father. What did that mean? I cleared my throat. I mean, did they elaborate what that would mean? I think you know what it means, Ranger said. He barked out laughter, but it was a hollow sound that sounded more maniacal than amused. I think you're smart enough to deduce that if the council feels threatened by things, they remove the problem. I nodded. Yeah, I swallowed the tightness in my throat. I did know. Or I could leave myself, he continued. Instead of resuming his pacing, he crossed his arms over his chest and waited. I could give up the council, give up everything my family had sacrificed for me to be there. I would be nothing. I would be no one. I pressed my lips together. It was obvious which option he'd chosen. He wouldn't be standing in front of me, hiding away in some working class community if he was still a junior council member. And yet, it sounded like the council had offered him a way to go back to normal living. What happened? My heart tremored in my chest, and I waited, though I did not think I would like what he had to say. Obviously, I chose Cliff, he said in a small voice. His gaze dropped to the floor and he clenched his jaw. I had to. I had to be true to myself, to him, to my feelings for him. I couldn't imagine pretending to be someone I wasn't, because I was scared. I refused to live my life like that. I shot Allison a look. I didn't even know what I was asking her for. Did I want answers? Should I ask him questions? Was I even allowed? This wasn't helping the situation I found myself in. But in the end, Cliff didn't choose me, he continued, finally looking up at me. He locked eyes with me, the dark orbs burning into mine as though he wanted me to understand how serious he was about what he was telling me. Not because he didn't want to, but because the council punished him. They punished him because of me. I don't even know where he is to this day. He rubbed his lips together, and I saw his eyes glimmer with unshed tears. I know he didn't choose me because the council showed me exactly what he said. There was no magic manipulation. He gave them everything about me, and still they punished him. That doesn't sound like that's your fault, I burst out. He flinched, almost like he forgot I had the capacity to speak at all. Yes, it is, he said. I knew exactly what I was risking by being with him, and I did it anyway. You think Matlock doesn't know that just by being with you put you at grave risk? And he still did it. Twice, from what I understand. I swallowed hard. I didn't like that Allison seemed to have told him everything, but at the same time, maybe I needed to hear it. Maybe I needed to comprehend that what Matlock and I had done had grave consequences, even though we'd stopped. If I was around, there was still a possibility my father would fall to harm. If I had a child here, or even in the human realm, the council would find out and everyone I knew and loved would be in danger. I couldn't let that happen. I had to do something. I had to protect them. I can't go with you to the human realm, Allison, I said, turning to look at her. I can't risk you. Jen, she warned. She tilted her head forward, almost as though she was telling me no. I cut her off. Didn't you just hear his story? I asked. He laughed and his boyfriend was still punished. I won't risk you. They'll find you, even in the human realm. You know they will. And they'll find me. They'll find... I stopped myself from saying anything more. Even if Allison told Ranger everything, that didn't mean I needed to confirm it. My heart hammered against my chest. Was there some place I could go that they couldn't find me or my child? Not exactly, Ranger said slowly, lifting his finger. You could go to the human world. There is a way, but it's risky. I opened my mouth. Was this guy deaf? Did he not hear what I just said? What? Allison furrowed her brow. How is that possible? You create your own realm, he said. His tone seemed to imply it was simple, like talking about the weather or how to make cereal. I was looking into it when I was still debating what I intended to do with the Council's ultimatum. You could go to the human realm and create your own realm from there, tying it to the human one. It's practically undetectable. My own realm? I asked. Even saying the words felt strange, like it was some kind of joke. I looked at Allison, but she shrugged and shook her head. She didn't understand it either. How is that possible? I looked back at Ranger, waiting for some kind of response. It sounded like a fairy tale. Only the council members had a private realm. It was for the rich and powerful, not people like me. The thought that I could create one for myself, for my child, didn't seem possible. It sounds dangerous, Allison put in. From my peripheral, I saw the way she crossed her arms over her chest tightly. She was worried for me, I realized. Unsure if she'd made the right decision by bringing me here to Ranger. It is, Ranger admitted. He looked down at the floor, jaw locked. For a moment, I wasn't sure if he was going to continue. Finally, he pulled his eyes back up and resumed his pacing. I wouldn't even be telling you this, but I know you have a particularly special circumstance. His eyes dropped to my stomach. I whipped around, glaring at Allison. So, she had told him everything. How could she betray me like that? Even if she thought she was protecting me, she wasn't. She was just putting more people at risk, more responsibility on my shoulders. She didn't say anything, Ranger said before Allison could defend herself. I can sense your child within you. I blinked, narrowing my eyes. I stared at his handsome face, trying to see if there was any way I could detect a lie. When I found nothing, I sighed. My anger disappeared, leaving me with emptiness. I had all of this rage in me. Anger at myself, at the circumstance I created for myself, at Matlock because he didn't have to be bothered with the fallout. But that wasn't Ranger's fault. It wasn't Allison's fault either. I locked eyes with Ranger again. Something bubbled up inside of me, and I realized it was respect. I respected him in that moment, and appreciated the fact that he was willing to help me, even knowing my particular circumstance. You said it's dangerous? Allison pushed, raising her brows. It is, he said. I can help you, but I would need to connect the realm to your magic. It's the only way to keep things secret. But? I asked. It will drain your life force, he said. You will die long before your time. But it will protect my child? I asked, placing a hand on my stomach. He nodded. That was enough for me. If I was gone, maybe they wouldn't go after my father. He had nothing to do with me or Matlock. I could disappear. When can we do it? I asked. 3 days from now, Ranger replied. Perfect. That gave me enough time to write a letter to my father, trying to tell him everything and nothing at the same time. It was going to hurt badly being separated from him, but it was the only way to ensure his safety. It was also the day of Matlock's arranged marriage, which seemed like the perfect day to disappear. Chapter 15. I didn't sleep much. I couldn't. I was about to throw my life away and start a new one simply to ensure the safety of my child, Allison, and my father. I didn't want the council to punish anyone else for my selfishness. I rolled over, looking at the ceiling I shared with Allison. She insisted I stay over after I refused to go home. I couldn't risk going back after everything. I wouldn't be surprised if the council was watching the place, waiting for me. Whether Graham or Chastity told them about my little visit to their engagement party, I didn't know. I just didn't want to take the risk. I placed my hand on my stomach. I wanted to hate Matlock. Not because I blamed him for everything that had happened. I didn't. I took my share of the responsibility for the situation we found ourselves in. I understood that. But it would just be easier if I did hate him. It would make the ache in my heart go away, the guilt that ran through me like blood simmer into nothing. I still wasn't sure if I was making the right decision about not telling him about our child. He should know. It was his child too. Something we'd created out of love, and not some tradition or obligation. And yet, I couldn't tell him. I couldn't trust him with that knowledge. The council knew everything. They would find out. I couldn't imagine what they would do to Matlock in order to get that information either. I didn't want to think about it. I rolled on my side, trying to get comfortable. I placed a hand on my stomach, trying to imagine my belly swollen with a child. What would I look like? Would my breasts get bigger? I hoped so. I always wanted bigger breasts. I giggled at myself. The sound was hollow, foreign to my own ears. I couldn't remember the last time I'd laughed. It felt strange but good. I realized that I wanted to make sure there was laughter in this realm I was creating for me, for my child. I wanted to make sure it was happy. But I also wanted it protected. I wanted it to learn about magic. I wanted it to control it, to learn about it. My offspring would have to protect him or herself because there would be a time I wouldn't be around. And as long as my child drew breath, it would be at risk. Tears blurred my vision, and I pressed my hands against my stomach even more firmly than before. "I'm so sorry," I said. I didn't know if the baby could hear me or not. I never thought. I sucked in one breath, then another. I never meant to get us into this. Honestly, I didn't mean to have you. Not that I regret you. I think you're the best thing that's ever happened to me. The only thing I did right. I sniffled, rubbing my stomach now. I still stared up at the ceiling, my eyes filled with tears. "Can I tell you a secret? I'm scared. Terrified. I feel like the world is coming undone around me and if I don't make exactly the right decision, I'm going to get swept away in this maelstrom of fire and water and everything. And it's not just me, it's you and my father and Allison and everyone near and dear to me. And I just don't know what the right decision is. And that scares me because I need to know, or else what happens to you? Me? Everyone else?" I blew out a shaky breath and shook my head. I tried blinking back the tears, but they just kept coming. I probably shouldn't be blubbering like this to the baby. I was supposed to be strong. I was supposed to protect it through everything, but right now, I was just swept up in my emotions. "I don't even know if creating my own realm is possible," I said. "I'm a powerful witch. No matter what anyone says, you got that from me, you hear? Matlock may be the High Warlock, but he's not as powerful as I am. As you will be. I'll make sure of that. I refused to let my child be weak. Not when there was my magic in its veins. And as much as I wanted to dismiss Matlock's magic as insignificant, it wasn't. He was powerful. There was a reason the council wanted him. But he wasn't as powerful as I was. Anyway, I'm losing track of what I'm trying to say, I said, sucking in a breath. I want you to know that I have no idea if this is even going to work. And it scares the shit out of me. But I also know that I'd do anything for you. Anything. It's crazy. I never thought I'd love anyone the way I love you. I never had a mom, really, to love me. I thought maybe I wouldn't make a good mom, and I still don't know if I will be a good mom, but I know I love you. And I'm willing to do whatever it takes to ensure that you're safe. Even if it's crazy. More tears roll down my cheeks, and I close my eyes and huff out a breath, and then another. I don't know how I managed it, but sleep finally came. I was late to meeting up with Ranger and Allison, having told my friend to go on without me when I struggled to get ready. Finally? Ranger said, gesturing at me with his arm. You realize we were about to leave, don't you? What could have possibly kept you? Hey, back off, Ranger, Allison said, pulling me into a hug. Sorry, I said meekly. Morning sickness. Ranger's eyes flashed with something similar to regret, but it quickly disappeared. We've got to get a move on, he said. The wedding ceremony will be happening right now, and everyone in the council will be there, which means we have some leeway here. We still must be cautious. Anyone could sense something shift, even in the human realm. I still don't understand how all of this is supposed to work, I admitted sheepishly. Maybe it was the fact that I hadn't gotten much sleep last night. Maybe I still couldn't wrap my head around what this was supposed to do, how this was supposed to protect me and my child. Basically, you're going to create your own realm using a piece of yourself, Ranger said over his shoulder as we began to make our way through a portal to the human realm. Unless they can trace your magic, they won't be able to find your realm. How do you know they can't trace my magic? I asked, shooting him a look. We stepped into the portal before he could respond. Without warning, we were thrust into the human realm. I had to clutch onto Allison to keep myself from stumbling forward and falling. My stomach twisted with nausea. Normally, I wouldn't have handled it in such a way, but I wasn't lying when I said I had morning sickness. The second we were on solid ground, it took a moment for me to right myself. Ranger waited, doing a terrible job of keeping the annoyance off his face. I flipped him off. He smirked, respect flashing in his eyes before that too disappeared. The guy had a thing about showing emotion. I couldn't exactly blame him for it either. Not when the council had taken everything from him. Not when he was betrayed by the man who was supposed to love him. We walked down the street. I started to recognize some of the places, the trees. It still boggled my mind how urban everything it was. Where was the nature to lose yourself in? Where was the calm, the serenity that was supposed to make grounding easier? If my child was going to learn magic, learn how to be the most powerful witch I could make her, the human realm was much too distracting. To answer your question, Ranger said as we came to a crosswalk, I don't know if they'll be able to trace your magic. Have you given them a reason to? Well, I said, thinking back to the party I crashed. Perhaps. I don't know. I was warned away, and I left. Ranger tapped his chin. That might work out for you then. If they think they've scared you off, they might be too arrogant to verify if you're really gone. I wasn't so sure. I remembered the way Charity looked at me. I remembered the threat hanging between me and Graham. I wasn't so sure they'd let me go so easily. You have to make the choice, Genevieve, Ranger said. Suddenly, we were in front of Allison's grandmother's home. Instead of moving on, he stopped and looked at me expectantly. We can't do any of this if you're not absolutely sure that this is what you want. I took in a deep breath, and then another. I looked at Ranger, and then at Allison. I wasn't sure what I was trying to find in them. All I knew was that I wanted to make the right decision, but what that right decision was, I didn't know. I stayed up all night, crying, tossing and turning, and I was still not sure what I was going to do. I was grateful Allison and Ranger gave me time to really think about it. I wasn't sure what I'd do if I had their voices in my head, preventing my own thoughts from coming through. Not like it would make any difference. I was helpless. I blew out a breath, scuffing my toes on the concrete sidewalk. I crossed my arms over my chest, trying to figure out what I would want to do if I was a child and my mother was in the position I was in. I was scared. I was scared. I was scared for my friends, my family, but for my child most of all. I knew if the council had knowledge of my pregnancy, they would hunt me down until they found me. They couldn't have Matlock's bastard roaming around, especially if there was some way it could inherit the title of High Warlock. I wasn't clear as to the details, but details didn't matter to me. Not right now. This was the only way. I have to do this, I said, locking eyes with him. I saw Allison shift beside me. It was clear she wasn't as sure as I was about this whole thing, but Ranger understood. He had gone through it, and while we had ultimately made different decisions on how to handle it, there was an understanding between us that only came from experience. It's going to be painful, he said seriously. You're literally removing a part of your magic in order to create a realm. It will continue to feed on you until there's nothing left. What? Allison dropped her arms from her chest and looked at Ranger, almost as though she was waiting for the punchline. Like she didn't quite believe what he was saying. When he said nothing, she turned her gaze to me. General. I looked back at her with a steady gaze. I have to, Allison, I said. There's no other way. Yes, she said. Yes, we'll find one. The two of us. Together. No. Ranger was the one who spoke, and I was glad for it, because tears suddenly accumulated in my eyes. My life as I knew it would change forever. There isn't any other way. Maybe if it was just her, it would be different. But it's not. She has a child, Allison. Everything changes when a child is involved, especially one that could shake the very foundation of everything the Council stands for. Allison sucked in a breath. Her eyes flashed, and I knew she was getting ready for a fight. He's right, I said. Look, Allison, I'm scared. I'm terrified. But I am all my child has. I can't just sit around and wait for life to catch up to us. I have to do something. I swallowed thickly, wishing she could understand but knowing she couldn't. I just needed her to trust me. My mother died and I grew up with only one parent, so I know I can do this. I have the opportunity to stay with my child, to be there for it, to protect them in a way she never could for me. And I can't take that for granted. But, Allison's voice cracked and it broke my heart. But you'll die, General, you'll die before you have to. If you use your magic to create a world for you and your child, one you can't leave. Tears started falling. You'll die. Then what? What happens to your world? Your child? I'll tell them about you, I said, feeling my own eyes start to water. I'll tell him or her that they can go to you, they can trust you. I'll teach it to keep the realm alive, and if that doesn't work, I'll tell it how to use magic to create a home, even if it's not in a secret realm. Allison looked like she wanted to argue, but there was nothing she could say that would change my mind. I think she knew that too, because she turned away from us, sniffling. What do I need to do? I asked Ranger. Well, there's a place a couple of blocks from here, he said. We could tie it there, so it's not obvious it leads directly to Allison's place. And then you reach deep inside of yourself, deeper than you've ever gone. Using your magic, you'll pull something out of you. And from there, you'll smother yourself in it. It will only recognize you, Jen, and anyone you give a specific designation to. Because it's literally part of you. I nodded, taking his words in. It will be painful, he said. And honestly, I don't even know if it'll work. It has to, I said. There's no other way. I agree, he said. Then if there's nothing else, let's go. Let's do this while we still can. I followed Allison and Ranger to where they wanted to tie my realm to, one hand on my stomach. Even now, I didn't know if this was the right choice. But honestly, it was the best one for me and my child, and that was all that mattered to me in the end. Even if that meant I would be alone, with no one to love the way I loved Matlock, even if it meant I would die before my time, if my child survived and thrived, I could go peacefully in the dark night and not regret a thing. Epilogue. 10 years later. No, Ava. It was a hot summer day. Sweat dripped down the back of my neck, rolling along my spine. I could wave my hand and make the weather disappear. I could turn the skies gray and make it rain, but I didn't. I tried to keep the weather consistent with that of the human realm, just to give the girls something natural, in a place that was created entirely from magic. Your technique is all wrong, I told her again. I wanted to roll my eyes, but I held back. My eldest daughter, now 9, was as stubborn as her father. It was difficult teaching her anything, and every time I tried, she fought back. She wanted to do it her way or no way, and there was nothing I could do to make her behave differently. "Mom," she said, folding her arms over her chest. She rolled her eyes, a skill she'd picked up by the time she was 2. I had no idea where she even learned it from, but it grated on my nerves. "Why do you always say that?" "Because it's always wrong," I said. I waved my hand to my 8-year-old, Bella. She was the spitting image of her father, and it was painful to look at her. I always tried to make sure she couldn't see the emotion in my eyes when I interacted with her. "Bella, come over here and show your sister how to do it." Ava rolled her eyes again. It was like it was her default mode. "Mom," she said in that same emphatic tone. "I don't need my little sister showing me how to do basic magic. I'm not a baby." A burst of giggles pierced the otherwise silent outdoors. I pressed my lips together to keep myself from smiling. My youngest, Courtney, had this contagious way of laughing that made it hard for me not to react. The problem was, if I smiled, Ava would take it to mean I was laughing at her, and she would get even more emotional and frustrated than she already was. "Shut up, Court," Ava snarled. Courtney only laughed harder. "Don't speak to your sister that way," I snapped, flaring my nostrils. I lifted my fingers and began to tinker with the locket that hung around my neck. It always soothed me in times of great stress, like now when I was teaching my 3 daughters magic. I refused to raise them as humans. They knew exactly what they were, powerful witches by the time they could talk. My goal was to teach them everything I knew before our world faded away. And it was only a matter of time. Ava narrowed her eyes at my fingers. "Why do you keep touching that?" she asked. I wanted to throw my hands up and stomp away. The girl was annoyingly stubborn, but there was a strength in her I'd never possessed. A confidence I couldn't quite attain. She was bold in a way that made me respect her. "Try again," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. She muttered the spell with attitude, causing the cup of water to spill out and hit her face. This time I did laugh. "Mom," she exclaimed, her voice shrill. Courtney burst into giggles again. Even Bella smiled as she tucked hair behind her ear. "Again," I said to all 3 of them. "You should be able to control the water and bend it to your will. Keep practicing. I'm going to go and get lemonade." "Why don't you just magic it here?" Ava asked with a sneer, water dripping down her face. Courtney's laughter only deepened. That girl was cheeky. One day, that would get her in trouble, but I wasn't going to worry about it now. I could only appreciate the time I had, the present, because it was slipping away so quickly, I was having difficulty holding on to it. I turned and headed for the house. When I reached the door, I looked back, watching my daughters. All were Matlock's children. All were created out of love, out of desire. Even today, I couldn't say why I went back, not once but twice to see him, each time resulting in a child. There had been a 4th, a little boy. My throat tightened just thinking about him. He hadn't survived the birth, and if it hadn't been for Allison's quick thinking and healing magic, I wouldn't have survived either. After that, I decided I was never going back. I didn't tell Matlock about them, about his children, my heart and soul. Not because I wanted to hide them away from him, but to protect them. I didn't trust the council. I never would. My breath left me. I reached out to clutch the doorframe. Weakness hit me unexpectedly, and I struggled to stay standing. I locked my knees and concentrated on my magic, the thread of connection to the realm. I had to keep everything strong. Everything in place. Nothing was more important than my daughters. When the feeling finally left, I shook myself and exhaled slowly. It was happening at least once or twice a month now. Not enough for me to worry, but enough for me to realize my time here was not finite. I must prepare my girls for what would happen, to give them all the information I could, and show them how to protect themselves should they need it. I wasn't going to be around forever. And I'd be damned if I left my girls helpless. I leaned against the doorframe, finally free to touch the locket again. If only Matlock were here. If only he could see what his offspring could accomplish. Bella was incredibly smart. More intelligent than I could ever be. But she was also quiet, observant. She was so unlike Ava, but she had her own subtle strength she didn't get enough credit for. And Courtney, my baby. She'd kill me if I called her that. Besides being cheeky, she was persistent. If I thought Ava was stubborn, she was nothing compared to my flame-haired Courtney. And her temper matched her hair. I loved all three of them. I even loved their father still. I didn't think that would ever change. This wasn't the life I'd expected, but loving the Warlock gave me three beautiful daughters who would grow up and change the world. I couldn't ask for more than that. The end. If you enjoyed Loving the High Warlocks, you will love Sisters of the Coven, the beginning of Ava's story. Available here now. Otherwise, read on for a sneak peek. Sisters of the Coven. Daughters of the Warlock, Book 1. By Amelia Shaw.